Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
Welcome one and all to the Defiant Takes Football Show. I'm Max Dean. You can find me on Twitter at @TheMaxDean. I'm here with Nick Merriam, our Director of Draft Content and Scouting, at Nick with Sports on Twitter, and Kyron Samuels, who's our offensive line expert and insider here at DTF. Now, you can find him at Kyron Samuels on Twitter. And today is going to be an interesting show, right? Some people love to talk about it. Some people are very opinionated on it. But we are talking about positional value. And really, when I say that, what I mean is, what do we invest in players relative to what position they play? How much should we invest? What draft picks should we invest? What do we want to do to assemble the best roster the most effectively and efficiently? So, Nick, how you doing today, man? Are you looking forward to this conversation?
Yeah, definitely am. We've been kind of trying to get into this for a little bit, and just had some scheduling quirks and finally getting around to it. So I'm excited for sure.
And Kyron, I know that you kind of have some differing opinions to what mainstream media tends to push. So, I want to give you your opportunity to talk about this. How are you doing today?
Let me turn my mic on. I'm doing really well. So yeah, I'm excited to get into this too. So it's definitely been a point of contention with us before. So it's like really interesting to see how people think about it and what coaches I know talk about it and kind of what players and agents expect versus what, GMs and owners and everybody that makes the decisions and the mainstream media tend to think. So it's a really interesting concept here.
Yeah, I feel like this is going to be good because we're going to get a number of different sides, right? Nick, you're fairly involved in the analytics community. You come at things from that perspective. I would say probably more than either of us. Kyron, you come at things from the player perspective, right? From the coaching perspective. So you kind of have that flavor of what is, what kind of impact does a player have on the game that might not be, readily visual, and push back on that. And then for me, it's like I look at things from a salary cap perspective a lot of the time. And so if we're looking at contracts, then that kind of gives me what, my opinion on what we should be investing into a player versus how available they are, et cetera. So I think this will be an interesting one. Let's shout out Noah Ashley, our producer. Appreciate you putting everything together as always while I'm, trying to do everything on a few hours of sleep. Noah, how you doing today, man?
Doing well. Had a long weekend. Didn't get much sleep like you, but we're here another Monday, ready to get going.
As we tick closer to the draft too, I'm getting excited, right? And one of the reasons I'm particularly excited to talk about this today is because as we watch more players, we're doing our film breakdowns and so on. I'm kind of putting together my top 50, my big board, and I'm kind of asking myself, how good is this player relative to other players, right? Is he that much better than everybody else at this position? And so he's my clear number one for this group. But how far up do I push him over another guy, right, who plays a more premium position? Do I want to draft this player because I know how good he is, or do I want to wait because I know that this position is harder to find, right? Well, I take a lesser player at that position. So I think this is the biggest time of year to have that chat, and let's jump into it. So I think first and foremost. Or first of all, maybe not foremost, but quarterback, right? We pay these guys exorbitant amounts of money, huge amounts of money with massive guarantees. And the reality is that there's just only a few people on the planet who can throw the ball well enough to, really be a threat to opposing defenses. And there's only a few guys on the planet who can dissect defenses efficiently and rapidly and consistently. And then there's even fewer that hit both of those check marks, right? That's why we push these guys up towards the top of the draft. That's why, we might see 3 quarterbacks go in the first 3 picks this year. Things seem to be trending in that direction. So, Nick, if you want to talk a little bit about quarterbacks and what you perceive their value to be.
Yeah, I think you'd be hard pressed to find anyone who wouldn't argue quarterback is the most important position in football. I mean, it's kind of a discussion, relative to what comes after it, how important it is. I don't think you can really put a number on it, but if the analytics community were to, there was a war study that said it was like 4 times more valuable than the tier 2 positions, which basically is just saying that it's very, very valuable, right? I don't know if I'd put that much of an emphasis on it because I do think quarterback play can stem from other pieces around, surrounding talent, what's going on, in terms of your system and, who the coaches are, things like that necessarily haven't been measured as well by the analytics community. But there's a reason these contracts continue to get higher and higher and higher. It's because there's such a high demand for the position that the market for it continues to increase. And you're starting to see teams kind of evolve their theory on how to get that franchise quarterback in terms of using resources, whether that be sinking tons of draft picks into the position until they finally hit on one, or, this is not really a new strategy, but some teams are trying to flip for different free agent quarterbacks every year until they finally get a guy that fits. We've seen teams more aggressively go after it because of how important it is. And now I think what's become more fascinating, I think this year with the Jalen Hurts discussion, is the idea that really having a good quarterback on a rookie contract might be better than having a great quarterback on a contract because of how highly these guys are getting paid.
Right. So that is a debate right now, whether it is worth it to pay this middle-ish tier of quarterback veteran money, because there just doesn't really exist a robust intermediate market for these guys. You got these guys who are getting paid 40, 50 million per year with massive guarantees. And then you've got guys who are, paid somewhere in the 20s maybe, or in the teens for like this bridge quarterback world that nobody expects to be around very long for that particular roster. And then you got true backups. And then you got draft picks. Draft picks are basically paid like true backups, right? So the discrepancy between what guys are paid on the second contract, even if they're not a difference-making type of player, versus, how much money you can save and invest in other positions for these younger quarterbacks, for these rookie deals, it's massive. And so people are talking about, is it worth it? And so far, everyone has still said, yes, it's worth it to pay these guys, right? I don't think anybody's been, for the most part, teams have not been brave enough to actively choose not to pony up and pay that guy. I mean, we just saw it with Daniel Jones, right? He's played quite a few years in the NFL, and there were a lot of issues with the game. He had his best year by far, but still, kind of wasn't an elite quarterback by any stretch, but he's getting near elite money, at least for shorter term. And Giants just didn't feel prepared to just allow him to move on. We've seen maybe a little bit more of a shift towards multiple guys getting in that $20 million range for that bridge quarterback, but we'll have to see if that's just like a blip on the radar or a consistent trend. So Kyron, what is your perspective on the quarterback position, and how valuable do you find it? Maybe that's a dumb question, but honestly, I want to know.
Well, there's no question how valuable quarterback play is. It's the most important position on the field more times than not. Only thing I would say, there's a big discrepancy with how I view the quarterback position and how they get paid. I think the gap between the pay is pretty insane at sometimes. I remember we were talking to a couple of my guys yesterday, a couple of days ago, and he was saying, man, these quarterback contracts are really bad. And he was referencing, Kyler Murray, Deshaun Watson, Matthew Stafford, Russell Wilson, Daniel Jones, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm like, I raised the point. I was like, listen, I think every quarterback deal in the NFL is really bad right now, except for Mahomes and Allen, because they got them a couple years ago. So, I think we put a little too much value into how much we're paying quarterbacks and quarterback play sometimes, because you look at these contracts, man. Some of these contracts are insane. And then, like you just said, look at the guys who are really successful on these rookie deals. If you compare it to the guys that are getting paid, it's pretty insane, the amount, the discrepancy between the actual pay and the actual talent on the field. Jalen Hurts was infinitely better than Russell Wilson this past year. A lot of that has to do with, supporting cast. I mean, you said that a little bit earlier, Max, but supporting cast definitely plays a factor here. But just period. He's better. He's younger. He's healthier. He's just in a different groove right now. So I think the gap between the pay is too large. But I do understand it from an organizational standpoint. Quarterbacks, more times than not, are the people that are putting the butts in the seats. Everybody has built their Super Bowl type winning teams around quarterback play for the last however many years. But I do think we're starting to see a shift, though. You got Brock Purdy. I mean, look at what Brock Purdy did last year. He was he, Mr. Irrelevant, I believe. He was the actual last pick in the draft, and he goes from last pick in the draft to leading the team to an NFC championship. And a lot of people believe that if he doesn't get hurt in that game, that they have a chance to win that game. So you look at guys like him, even guys like Jimmy Garoppolo. Kyle Shanahan's done a lot with the little, if we're talking about talent at the quarterback position. And the 49ers have done a lot with little without paying the position handsomely. So we've seen teams have sustained success without paying quarterbacks. So this notion that you have to pay the quarterbacks to get it done is like, it's kind of not true, because we've seen it happen before. I mean, Nick Foles won a championship as a backup in Philadelphia not too long ago. I wouldn't say Matthew Stafford played out of this world in 2020. I think he played good enough. You know what I mean? He was better than Jared Goff was, but the idea that you have to pay this otherworldly quarterback otherworldly money to win a championship, I just don't think is that true.
Right. Well, I think the biggest challenge that decision makers face when we have this conversation is, how bad is it going to look if it doesn't work out the way that you want it to? I think, logically speaking, whether we agree with the amount of money that quarterbacks get paid at the very top or we disagree with that, I mean, I know that Jason Fitzgerald from Over the Cap, he actually believes that quarterbacks are underpaid relative to their value in the NFL, right? And so I think that that's a deeper conversation that we can have. But either way, I think we can all agree that the difference between, what guys get paid who are, 7, 8, 9, 10 at the position, and then what the rookies get paid makes those rookies more valuable. The issue really is that if you let one of those guys move on, and then you draft a player and he's an unmitigated disaster for any reason, or even just not as good as your middle of the road guy, then you are probably not keeping your job, right?
Yeah.
So that's the issue that we face. So I think anytime we have conversations about how, why GMs or whoever it might be don't make certain decisions that seem obvious from an analytics perspective, it's ultimately that. It's ultimately, how bad will I look if this doesn't work out, versus how bad will I look if I roll with that, the mainstream ideology, right? And I think that we see that in the draft as well sometimes, where it's like, do I reach for this player even though I really like him because everybody else doesn't seem to think so, right? Am I better off taking a player who's in that consensus range, even if he doesn't work out, than taking a player I believe in, because I don't want to be, skewered if he doesn't work out because everybody else said he wasn't as good as I thought he was. So that's always a line that they have to walk. Nick is talking about the first GM to embrace the never pay quarterback mantra, who just trades and moves on. I mean, I think, that is the core of what we're talking about. And it's just, you got to have the kind of success that Howie Roseman has had everywhere else to even consider that. Because again, it's just job security in this business. It just doesn't exist, for a very, very select few. If Andy Reid decided he wanted to do it, if we just happened to have a guy that wasn't as incredible as Mahomes, maybe at this point he's got the pull to do something like that. But there's just so few guys who could survive something like that, I think, if it didn't work out. So, if we're looking at how much these guys are paid versus, where we get them in the draft, I mean, what do you think, Nick? Are you a big believer in the idea that you should just be moving on? And what caliber of player does it need to be for you to be comfortable and say, yes, we just need to pay this guy and not consider going back to the draft?
Well, I'm a big believer in you pay guys for continuity. Like, I'm not a big pay some free agent a ton of money on the open market and bring him in because you don't know what it's going to look like necessarily. But I think if you have a guy on your roster who's played well, he probably deserves the money he's generally going to ask for if you want to keep the success you have going. The problem with the quarterback market is we don't have a secondary market. It hasn't really emerged. And, you would think guys like Daniel Jones, Geno Smith, and Jimmy Garoppolo this offseason maybe help create that. Garoppolo did kind of, so did Smith a little bit, but really like Daniel Jones getting about $40 million kind of blurs the lines between that and really creating a secondary market, which is what is needed kind of for these guys in the range of like the 8, 9s, 10s quarterbacks in the NFL. And because, all these guys have continuously, ever since like Andy Dalton and Tannehill got their first deals, been paid, they became the highest paid quarterbacks in football when those guys got paid. And it's just kind of continued to spiral from there. The problem with the position is if you don't have a guy who's decent, you don't have a chance to like contend, right? So you have to have some form of an answer. And yeah, we see these Jalen Hurtses, we see these Brock Purdy's who can come out, play early, and look good. But these are situations where the rosters are very complete and weren't necessarily teams that were really relying on great quarterback play before they got there. In which case, when Hurts plays really well, like it really accelerates who the Eagles are. The Niners, I think there's a gap between them and the Eagles. I think we saw that. I think more complete roster in Philadelphia, and with even Brock Purdy playing good football, you could tell that, just with him early on, kind of like how the Eagles were able to move the ball on them and how he's getting pressured right off the jump. But it's an interesting question because we can pull out these data points. Like, there was a year back when Nick Foles plays like 3 really good games. And again, it's like 3 games, right? That could happen with anybody. Like Josh Johnson could have had an amazing NFC championship and win the Super Bowl, and we would be talking about how great he is. And in reality, Josh Johnson is a career backup. Like Nick Foles ends up going to a bunch of other teams, and as it turns out, he's not really a starter, right? He happened to play some of his best football in that 3-game span. Blake Bortles, another guy who I think got a pretty good contract from Jacksonville for Jacksonville in terms of determining if he was going to be their guy or not, because he wasn't, despite playing a pretty good year before, and then ended up moving on and then getting Nick Foles actually, and then eventually Trevor Lawrence. But so this season, Hurts is going to get paid a ton of money because he's a really good player. The Niners are going to continue looking at the quarterback position because I don't think Kyron is. I'm definitely not sold completely on what Brock Purdy did yet because, again, this is a guy that played half a season, and we'll see if it continues. I remember back when Kirk Cousins played a full season for Washington, his first time was good. I wasn't a fan of paying him initially, even though it would have been in like the low 20 millions, because I wasn't certain that the guy was going to continue to play that well. They had really good weapons at the time. It is a difficult position to evaluate with a 16-game sample size. We've seen guys have really strong seasons and just never do anything again. Heck, you can make an argument like Cam Newton's an awesome quarterback, and he was really good for most of his career. He had like 1 elite season, which I really think kind of bends our look at that guy. Like, he's an awesome player. I don't know that he's like a Hall of Fame type player, but I think some people like put him in that discussion because of that one season where if it doesn't occur, he's probably not even close to that, right? So the evaluation of this position is so based on like the highs and lows that it becomes very difficult to kind of pinpoint a market when you're trying to pay based off of, outlier variables effectively.
So what do you think, Kyron? Final takes on the quarterback position before we talk about some of these other spots here. I mean, if you were calling the shots, who do you retain and how do you handle the position?
It just comes down to the rest of the roster, in my opinion. I think Nick said it. You look at Hurts, you look at Purdy. They didn't have to be great for the team to be successful because the roster was so great. I think that's kind of where my reference point is. If your roster isn't already good, why are you investing all this money into the quarterback position? People will look at it and say, well, you need a quarterback to do anything. And I'm just like, that's not necessarily true. The Tennessee Titans played a home football game to go to the playoffs this year, albeit in a bad division, but they played it without having a quarterback for half the season. And so, the quarterback position is indeed valuable. It's the most valuable. We know this. But if the rest of the roster isn't built for success to help that guy max out his potential, or to have a defense that while this guy figures it out and he's going under his construction period where he's learning the NFL, he's transitioning. We talked about the younger quarterbacks. Then why are you paying a quarterback right here? I think you build the rest of the roster, you build up the rest of the team, and then you go for it. The Browns did it. I don't think the Browns have been successful at it yet, but the Browns built up the rest of the roster to the best of their ability, and they went out and cashed out on the quarterback. It remains to be seen if that's going to be a good decision here. We'll see this year. The Denver Broncos are doing a lot now. They pay Russell Wilson, but it's different when you have Walmart money too. I will say that. But now they're building the roster how they should build the roster. They're building the roster from inside out. They did a great job retooling the offensive line. Word is they're going to be under construction with this wide receiver room. We'll see how they address stuff through the draft. That should be a much improved team due to building the roster from the inside out and then thinking about the quarterback position. I think That's the way to go. That's the way we've always seen it done. You look at Bill Belichick and all those teams, they didn't pay. Tom Brady was, I might be mistaken here, I don't think he was ever the highest paid quarterback in the NFL, maybe until this past year, 2020, maybe 2021. But they always found a way to get him a little bit of bonus and then restructure his deal so they could go build the rest of the roster inside out. And I think that's where you've seen the long-term sustained success, much like the Steelers and when they had Ben Roethlisberger. He was never the highest paid guy. They always found ways to restructure his deal, give him his little, give him his chunk, but make sure they had enough to keep the roster building the entire time. And you're seeing it with Mahomes in Kansas City. They have a great deal with Mahomes. That's why I said Mahomes and Allen are the only two quarterbacks that I think are on good deals because they can still build the rest of the roster. I know the Bills have had to restructure, pay some guys early, but they found ways to keep enough money to keep the rest of the roster, even if you have a lot of turnover, because the Chiefs have had a lot of turnover from year to year. They found ways to keep the roster building and improving and have versatility and have some leverage here. Now they have a ton of picks, a ton of money. They're coming off the Super Bowl. They can do whatever they want. It's because they set themselves up for this, as opposed to a team like the Rams who went all in and then they got their Super Bowl, right? But they let Jared Goff go, and now he's at Detroit doing really well. That team is on the up and up. They look like they're going this way. And then now you're in LA. You've paid Stafford all this money. You got your Super Bowl, but you're in a bad position money-wise. You don't know what Stafford has left. It's just twofold here. So I think, would you say Les Snead was a success? I think I would. I mean, he got a Super Bowl, but was that Super Bowl worth the next 10, 15 years of your franchise potentially? That remains to be seen. So I would build inside out and then pay my quarterback what he's worth and make sure that I have enough money to maneuver properly. I would never be in a position where I would pay a quarterback so much like the Cleveland Browns, where they're having a tough time. Well, they don't have a tough time now, but for the next 3 to 4 years, when they have a $60 million cap hit or whatever that is, it's going to be very tough to continue building a roster, even with the salary cap going up, with the TV contracts and all that stuff. It's going to help a little bit, but not enough to alleviate that. So I would build inside out every time. And then, once you get your quarterback, make sure you take care of him. But there's ways to do that without killing your salary cap. Give him his money. We see some guaranteed stuff a little bit more up front here, front loading the contracts or back loading the contracts. But there's always ways where you can maneuver it around and make sure you have enough money to take care of the rest of the guys.
Well, I think, one of the things that we need to talk about here too is when we look at quarterback contracts, there are ways to pay your guy more than anybody else while simultaneously ensuring that you're still getting value out of that, right?
Yep.
Mahomes is the perfect example because they got him under contract before Deshaun Watson. They got him under contract before anybody else who was in that pay window, right? Whether it was that year or the next year with Allen or Lamar or anybody that was coming down the pipe, they were like, we're going to get this done first. And we are simultaneously going to give him a ridiculous amount of money, but structure this contract such that within the next 3 years, he's not going to be at the top of the market anymore, like by a long shot. And then in the next 5, 6, 7, 8, he's going to be so far down from the most highly paid guys that despite having a second deal, he's actually going to be well underpaid versus the rest of the market. Now, that is a unique situation because he agreed to that deal, but there are ways to make sure that you are not paying your guy at the top of the market by being aware of when other quarterback contracts are coming down the line. Roethlisberger was paid more than anybody else at one point, but it was just so short because the Steelers got it done before a couple of their contracts came down. I believe Aaron Rodgers was the one who immediately jumped him.
Gotcha.
Right. And so these guys, they don't live at the top for very long if you're proactive about when those deals get done. I would love to see some guys doing that, whether it's Chargers, whether it's Eagles, whether it's the Bengals. And I will say the team that's probably going to get that done quicker than anybody else is going to be the Eagles, based on how proactive they've been with everything else. And then, we're going to be saying, oh, Jalen Hurts is the most highly paid quarterback in the NFL. Whoa. And that's going to last a couple of weeks, a month maybe, and then we're going to get the Burrow contract, and then we're going to get the Herbert contract, and then suddenly we're going to forget that he was ever the most highly paid, and then within a year he's going to be 5th or 6th because it's just going to keep rolling with Trevor Lawrence and everybody else. So I think timing is everything when it comes to quarterback contracts, and structure is everything, and you just got to realize what you can, what you can get back when you give up some concessions, right, in that negotiation. Just don't get stuck on certain things, and you can end up being in a very favorable situation. So, I think there are a lot more points that we can hit on that, but in the essence of moving on to some other positions, let's move on here. So, we know that there's probably going to be 3 quarterbacks going before anybody else. But, when you look at who is most likely to get selected next, regardless of position, if everything else is equal, for the most part, we're looking at pass rushers, right? So I kind of want to move down in terms of this perceived positional value. If passing is the most valuable skill in the NFL, the ability to consistently disrupt passing is probably the second most valuable skill in the NFL. So, Nick, do you see a difference in outside versus inside rush? Do you think that outside rush is more impactful? And then if it's slightly more impactful because maybe it's more consistent, if you got an inside rusher, does that value actually become higher because that's harder to find? So the ability to pair an inside-outside rusher, do you want to prioritize that? I mean, what do you think about pass rushers, about how much they get paid, how highly you prioritize them, and if there's a difference between inside and outside?
Yeah. So, so much of the discussion for me is super nuanced, and it's hard to just answer outside versus inside. I think generally, if you're going to pick one or the other, you probably want to pick inside because it has been harder to find inside pass rushers generally in the draft. However, the reason I think this position group goes higher is because we're actually probably best at discovering talent at these 2 positions out of all the positions in football. The hit rate on edge and pass rushing interior defensive linemen specifically is highest, right, at the top of the draft. It's difficult because I think when you talk about the trenches, they are position groups that you're more reliant on building the whole thing than just one wide receiver or one really good corner, allowing you to kind of slot guys down that are more kind of middling and match up against the 2 and 3 receivers. And because of that, paying these guys, depending on what the market is, can get a little complex when you're talking about, a TJ Watt making $30 million, in my opinion. Obviously a fantastic player that just affects the game regardless of who's next to him. But you have to be able to kind of fill out the rest of your front four to really round out that pass rush, because you rush as a unit, you block as a unit. There is a element of continuity there where it is important to, have all 4 players or all 5 players playing in sync. And so, if you end up in a position where you're paying one edge guy so much that you're just rotating the other 3 positions every year, you're not necessarily in the best spot. And I think we saw that kind of with the Bears and the Raiders early in Khalil Mack's career, right? The Steelers do a very good job of supplying, draft picks at depth at those positions. So it's never been an issue for them. So paying defensive linemen, to me, it's the same thing we said earlier, continuity matters, right? If you've got a guy that you think, is very valuable staying in your system and is more valuable for you than he is on another team, you need to keep him. The market for me is probably a little higher than I think I would pay edge players. I think I'm more likely to want to pay receivers, less so now because that market just exploded, but corners and tackles these days because of where those markets are. Tackles one that kind of, because Trent Williams set the market, you're a little, you got a little more leeway with other players. And interior wise, it's probably not bad to be paying those guys either, because no one's going to reach Aaron Donald's contract, right? That has set the market to a point where no one is going to reset it with a given contract at all. Even Chris Jones is probably not getting an extension that's going to be greater than Aaron Donald, I would expect, when he does get one. But because of the kind of availability in the draft of finding these guys, it's an interesting discussion because you can really build a good defensive line relatively quickly in the NFL, but it kind of relies on you investing resources one way or the other.
Right. And a lot of teams we're seeing both pay and draft, right? The 49ers kind of led the way with that, spending first-round pick after first-round pick at the position. Paid a couple of guys. They paid Armstead, paid Nick Bosa, still spending those high picks on the interior. But I guess my question is then, how hard is it to find guys who can do both stop the run and rush the passer? And, where do you surrender, right? Like, at what point do you prioritize a guy who can rush the passer and maybe not isn't that good against the run? How high do you push him up, Kyron? Like, if there's a guy that's like, his skill is going to be rushing the passer in the NFL, and I'm not really sure if he's ever going to be a great run defender, maybe because the size isn't necessarily there. How highly do you take him over other players at different positions who might be more well-rounded, but just don't possess that skill?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't. So you look at a guy like Will Anderson, you get a little bit of the best of both worlds. He can rush the passer. He's really good setting edges against the run. Those type of guys is why he's going to go, top 3, 5, whatever. On the other hand, you get a guy like Jalen Carter. I'm taking Jalen Carter over every other edge in this class. No question about it, because he gives you the best of both worlds. He's dominant against the run. Even when he's not making the play that gets recorded statistically, he's disrupting the play. He's affecting everything that goes on more than you will ever get an edge be able to affect the game just by the way the game is played. How quick the ball gets out now. How much the inside hitting runs we're getting now. You just won't be able to affect the game nearly as much from edge. Even as great as Nick Bosa is, I think Chris Jones and Quentin Williams affect the game more on a snap-to-snap basis than Nick Bosa does. That's just my opinion of how I watch the game. I mean, you get to see him being Chris Jones. I think he had 15 and a half sacks or 16 sacks from the 3-tech position. I mean, just ridiculous. You don't see that. Quentin Williams, I believe he had 15 sacks as well, and he missed 2 games. Like, the type of production we're seeing from the inside guys, pass rushing, and how stout they can be against the run and disruptive they can be against the run with tackles for loss, and just affecting the plays, blowing up plays. I think that's much more valuable than a guy like there's just going to be an edge rusher for you, because you can get that in the 3rd, 4th round. I don't think correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but I don't think there's been many interior guys that haven't gone ridiculously high, turn that type of production out that we've seen from Chris Jones, Quentin Williams, even Christian Wilkins. I mean, I think Christian Wilkins had almost 100 tackles this year and like 16 tackles for loss, something crazy. Like, he was uber productive down there in Miami. All these guys tend to go very, very high in the draft.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you see that nearly as much. But you can see a guy like where did Hassan Reddick get drafted? I believe he was a 13th pick.
Yeah.
Guys like that, you see those guys tend to come in the league, and there was an adjustment period. He was a good player, right? But he wasn't the type of player that he is now, 4 or 5 years into developing. Whereas guys like that made a transition.
They made him an off-ball linebacker, which they shouldn't have.
Right.
But,
you know what I mean? So it's like there's definitely more of a chance you can hit on guys later in the draft as well on the edge. Like I said, I keep going back to it, but correct me if I'm wrong. I just can't think of it. I'm really trying hard to think of a guy that has made a significant impact on the interior and didn't go in the top 15 picks in the draft. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, the one guy that comes to mind, and as much as we don't always do this on the show, you have to tip the hat to PFF because they had a 2nd-round grade on this guy, was Grady Jarrett, and that was just a miss on just like the guy didn't get watched. He was a 5th-round pick. He had the traits, he had the production in college, and it's just that's kind of the two things. The reason we're good at finding these specific players is it's like there are 2 correlations between success as a pass rusher in the NFL, right? It's traits, whether that be like speed, length, explosiveness, which is like your vertical jump, stuff like that. And then we can literally just sit here and, we could talk about like, what's the right way to do it? We could watch 2 guys go and we get 5 people and we could just say, okay, he won this rep. He won that rep. He won this. And like, it doesn't matter what, if we have 5 people and 3 of them, we go with like the actual answer on each of them, over time, like we're going to get like the right pass rush percentage for a guy. And it's going to tell us like how good the player is. And we don't need analytics people to do that, although they make us like think we do. But like it's it's scouting effectively. It's just like what looks good and what doesn't. It's not that hard to pick it out with pass rushers. I do think when we talk about pass rush versus run defense, there are a lot more run defenders that aren't good at pass rushing than there are good pass rushers that are like specifically so bad at run defending that it's an issue. Like right off the top of my head, like guys who like really excel at run defending, like you can think about like the Dontari Pose or like the who's the guy that Carolina drafted years back?
Star
Lodolele, like guys who like really are better against, and even like Jordan Davis who like has all these raw tools and like could end up being a great pass rusher is like a run defender. Vita. I think he put it together a little bit as a pass rusher. I think Deron Payne, quite frankly, also is a guy who like really needed to kind of find the pass rush a little bit to his game, and he has done better with that. Still has a ways to go, in my opinion. But these are guys that are run defenders first. Pass rushers only, like Yannick Ngakoue is a guy who's like a really good third down pass rusher who's like not good in run defense. Like you need to get off the field. And it's like there's not that many of those guys that like stick in the league, right? Generally, if you're a good run defender, like you can find a spot. But if you're a pass rusher, you're also generally good enough at that you're like pass rushing requires the traits and like the ability to learn. Run defense is a lot more disciplined base and technique and like, understanding how to one gap or whatever you're doing, right? And that can be learned in college. So you have guys who come to the league and you can take them like in the third round who understand that and get it. If you've gotten to a point that you're a really good pass rusher and you've had to like get your game to that point, you've probably learned how to defend the run in most cases.
Yeah, I agree. You have to learn because you ain't going to be on the field. You just said it. I mean, you have to adapt, especially at this level. Otherwise, you aren't going to be on the field, and you dang sure aren't going to get paid because, we're trying to wrap this up into value, right? You definitely aren't going to get paid if you can't offer at least a little bit of that run stuff. You have to be able to play more than one down on the field. It just is what it is. But you look at guys like Yannick, he's getting – what do you see? What do you think about his contract? I think he's gotten paid pretty fairly. He hasn't never been paid elite money, but he's gotten paid – because he can get you a double-digit sack year semi-consistently. So I think he's gotten paid pretty much around where he's worth. But then you see a guy like Nick Bosa who breaks the bank. I think you just see it in the pay discrepancy. I think these are fairly paid at the top of this.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I think that the pick value like also kind of lines up with how some of these guys get paid. That's why I think like the Chase Young contract, even though he's played really like 20 games, will be absurd when he gets paid by whoever pays him just because he was a number 2 pick. And I don't know if that's correct. If he goes out there and he, has another 8 sack season and he's good, like he's a great run defender. I don't know if he's put together as a pass rusher yet, but I worry about that as a Washington fan. Like, I think somebody might be willing to give this guy like $28 million a year just because of like the pedigree of what he could be, you know? And that's another thing that comes into it is like, you have all these raw players at the edge position that in year 4 or 5, like a Rashawn Gary, like turn it on and just become these elite players. And, the evaluation was like, this guy will probably be this, but the answer of will this be, in their 12th game or in their, 80th game is what's difficult to figure out.
Right. Well, I will say this, when you look at interior players, Kyron, you made a point about, most of these guys who have top contracts were drafted high or in the first round. And I think that's relatively true. When I did a study on it last year, if I remember right, 80% of the top 10 paid players were drafted in the first round. So, it's just hard to find those guys who warrant those contracts outside of it. If you look at the top paid guys right now, you've got Aaron Donald, Deron Payne, Leonard Williams, DeForest Buckner, Jonathan Allen, Vita Vea, Kenny Clark, Eric Armstead. So most of these guys were top guys. If you look at who's mixed in, who wasn't necessarily that high of a pick, there are a couple. Javon Hargrave, Chris Jones. He was a top 40 pick, but it was the second round technically. Draymond Jones was a third round pick. So, these are guys who didn't reset the market, but there's only a few mixed in. It's not impossible to find them, but there are a couple. And then if you look at edge rusher, it's a little bit more varied just because they're just guys who sneak in here that aren't necessarily that type of pick. There's still plenty of high first round picks at the top. TJ Watt, Joey Bosa, Myles Garrett, Khalil Mack, Bradley Chubb, Von Miller, Cam Jordan, who's still somehow one of the highest paid defensive ends, which is crazy, not because he's not good, but just because of his age at this point. But there's also quite a few other guys. There's Max Crosby, there's Harold Landry, Shaq Barrett, Emmanuel Ogbah, Carl Lawson, Trey Hendrickson. There's a lot of these guys who are paid around the top of the mark. I mean, they're maybe not at the top, but within the within that conversation, who are not necessarily first round picks, right? They're just a little bit more in terms of availability there. So, when we talk about these guys, then I think we look at what's harder to find, right? Are you more likely to find if you have a high first round pick and a high second round pick? Do you want to spend that pick on Jalen Carter? Because if you really need an edge rusher, maybe you can find that guy in the second or third round, right? Especially if we're going to be rotating these guys super heavily. All right, so as we move down, for a while, this position was actually below quite a few others, but it's now skyrocketed to the point that it's the third most highly paid position or skill, if you count pass rushers together, and that is wide receiver. Receiver last offseason in particular made major leaps such that it is now, I believe, third after edge rusher, but also has the most number of players who are paid in the top so-and-so of contracts, right? We have a bunch of them, a bunch of guys who are all paid right around the top of the market. It's not quite as spaced out as some of these other positions. Now, I will say that the contract that Tyreek Hill got and the contract that who else has kind of a
Debo got paid pretty nice.
Debo, yeah, there's
Devontae
Adams
was
the other one.
Yeah. Everything else is around 25.
Yeah, these guys are not actually paid what that number says, right? So these are kind of faux contracts to some degree. They're very much real, but that number is not really accurate. Really, they're getting paid around 22 something and 25 something for Adams and Hill respectively. But still, there's just so many other guys that are around the top right now. I mean, DeAndre Hopkins was never actually $27 million per year receiver. It just was not the case. But we got Cooper Kupp, got AJ Brown, got Stephon Diggs, got DK Metcalf, got Deebo Samuel, got Terry McLaurin, DJ Moore. All these guys signing contracts last year and all getting paid over $20 million per year now, not including Tyreek Hill and Devontae Adams. So, a major shift in terms of that market. A bunch of guys got paid. So we're feeling NFL teams say that this is a more valuable position than maybe in the past. The question is why? So Nick, you kind of talked about how you need multiple guys to fill out a defensive line as a rush group. Is it not the case for a receiver? Like, can you rely more heavily on just one dominant player? Why do you think that this has happened and teams have kind of turned the corner on this position? Because before it was behind tackle, it was behind cornerback, it was behind all the rushers. So what happened?
Well, I think first of all, you had like an all-time draft, right? And when that had AJ Brown and Debo and Terry and all these guys, and that kind of pushed the market. And it's going to happen again, in a few years when we're seeing it now with the interior defensive linemen. Like there was a really great draft that had a bunch of interior defensive linemen, so that market's going to go. And it could happen soon with like the tackle position. If we have a draft that like this year with a ton of tackles, it could be in 4 or 5 years, you'll see the tackle market explode. It's just kind of how it goes. It's cyclical. But I don't think this is such a tough discussion because I used to think like, oh, it's all about the passing game to a degree. Like it's just like what connects the quarterback to playing better, and that's true. Everything's about bringing out the best of your quarterback position, which is why we're talking about all these positions. It's why I don't believe that there's like a clear number 2 here. Like your pass rushers hit the QB, your O-line protects the QB, your wide receiver catches their passes, your corner defends against the passes. Right? They're all valuable positions, and I would have a really hard time picking out one of those mainly in the second tier because the corner market's also going to explode soon. But that's a whole other discussion. I do think, a Devontae Adams or a AJ Brown really does move the needle for your offense on their own, more to the extent than like a really great left tackle or one really great edge rusher moves your offense. The difference, I think, is you really need your 5th offensive lineman or your other opposite edge player to be solid, more solid than like your 3rd receiver. That being said, like a 2nd and 3rd receiver, like we're kind of seeing in Cincinnati, can also really push the needle. The difference being you can have a 2nd tight end that's really good or a 1st tight end that's really good, like Travis Kelce, that makes up for that, or a running back that can split out wide and play receiver. You can find different answers to that position group other than just drafting a ton of receivers, though it's not a bad idea necessarily to have that. I think there's maybe more like types of players that can make this position work in the NFL. That being said, I do think there is a correlation between, quarterback development and having that type of player. I think there's a correlation between, offensive success rate and having a number one. And I do think, the more good receivers you put in an offense, the more production they all will have, because you're taking away the ability for a defense to focus in on one player. The game's evolving. You're seeing more passing now. You're seeing more downfield passing. Naturally, the wide receiver position is going to get more valuable because of that. You're seeing just better athletes. It used to be like the best athletes played running back and quarterback, and that was it. Now they're everywhere. The good athletes are everywhere, right? So the receiver position is more valuable for the same reason I think, any other position is getting more valuable as time goes on. And I think we're going to enter a point in time where, I think we come to agreement on the fact that it's quarterback, and then depending on how you look at it for your own structure, all of these positions could be viewed as like the second most important one.
Right. And so Nick Andrews, he made a comment here about how most of the contracts are re-signed or at the very least trades and not available in free agency. Yes, that's correct. I mean, all of the players for the most part who are available, or who are getting these top tier contracts, that's generally true for. You can find some second tier pass rushers in free agency, I will say. But the real question that I have here is, how does that translate to draft priority? Because getting a lot of receivers is, it's awesome. I think it's a good idea. But when you look at all of the players who make up the top of this contract market, we don't see that same percentage of first round picks that we saw for quarterback, or that we saw for interior defensive line, or even edge. I mean, when you roll down the top of these players, you got Tyreek Hill, you got Cooper Kupp, you got AJ Brown, you got Stephon Diggs, you got DK Metcalf, you got Deebo Samuel, you got Terry McLaurin, you got Keenan Allen, you got Chris Godwin, you got Deontay Johnson, you got Christian Kirk, Tyler Lockett. I mean, well over half of the top of these guys are not first round selections. So
this.
What's that?
I got a point on this one too. I've heard it. Yeah, I got an answer for this.
Okay, so I want to throw it to Kyron first real quick, just because I want to give him a chance to talk here. But when you look at that, and I know that you understand the value of receiver just like anybody else. I mean, with Tyreek Hill going down to Miami and the kind of year that he had, and how, even without Tua playing, his threat still helped them make it to the playoffs. But, when you look at that and you understand, yes, it's an impactful position, but how available these guys are, where is it that you are trying to prioritize receiver in the draft, right? How good does a player have to be a receiver for you to say, this is who I want to go after, versus a player that might not be so available later?
I mean, it's really a simple thing in my mind. It's like, is the kid good enough? It's like, I feel like you see them in college and you know if they're good enough or not. Mm-hmm. We saw, I believe it was 2021, where we saw Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith, and I'm missing somebody, but I think 4 went in the top 10 pick or 11 picks that year. So like, when you have guys that were clearly that good in college, clearly going to be an impact. I feel like wide receiver is one of the easier positions to scout as well. Like, that if these guys are going to be impactful or not. If they have the skill set to translate. Like, people have questions about Jordan Addison's top end speed, but I have no idea. I have no doubt that he's going to be a good football player at the next level, because he understands route running, he understands spacing, he's sure-handed, and he knows how to manipulate defenses. Even if he's not a burner top end that's going to break the top off the defense, there's always a place for a guy like that. Now this gets to the point of the conversation. That's probably why he's going to go in like the 20s, or maybe fall into the second round, as opposed to go into top 10 or top 15. Whereas I think, you're going to see a JSN, he's going to go in the top 12, 13, 14 picks, in my opinion, because people are going to believe him. They saw him do the testing. He had elite short shuttle numbers, and you match that with the tape that we saw from him when he was healthy and on the field at Ohio State. That is a guy that's going to be a game breaker, a difference maker, a guy that's going to make that elite shift for you. So I think that's the difference right there. You can see it on the tape. You can evaluate these guys and really determine how good they are. Like, if Marvin Harrison Jr. was in this draft this year, I have no doubt in my mind that he would be a top 5 to 7 pick. Somebody would take him up there. I mean, or maybe we would see somebody trade up for a kid like that. There's just no doubt in my mind about it. If he stays healthy next year, he's going to be a guy that there's going to be not much debate about him being a top 5 to 7 pick if he stays healthy and has another type of year that we thought. or he could even sit out. I mean, we saw Jamar Chase do it. He sat out an entire year and still went, I believe, 4th overall to the Cincinnati Bengals. So when a team has a belief in you, or so let's say Miami, how different does Miami look without Jalen Waddle? Even with Tyreek Hill, if he's the only guy there, they needed to have Jalen Waddle there to match Tyreek Hill to really maximize the offense, maximize the potential of the team. And I think you saw how important wide receivers are in that draft. And I think you'll continue to see it. I think next year we'll have another big run. And even this year, I think we'll see a pretty big run from maybe the 20th pick to maybe like the 45th, 50th pick. I think you'll see like 5 or 6 receivers go in that time frame.
So, I mean, I get that. So is what you're saying that just because these guys were taken later in the past, they won't continue to be taken later because the contracts have gotten higher? Because it just still strikes me that if this is consistently where you're able to get these players who make this kind of impact, then, look, first of all, let me preface this. I love Jackson Smith-Njigba. I think he's really, really, really good. But at what point do you look at pick 12 or 11 and say, okay, do I need to prioritize a tackle here? Do I need to prioritize a defensive interior pass rusher here? Because I will be able to get a receiver in the second round. It's not really a question of, is this guy great or not? It's a question of, do I forego that greatness to get a greatness that's harder to find elsewhere when I know I can get a high quality player? That's really the crux of the wide receiver conversation to me. And maybe that shifts with the way that the market's gone, or maybe it doesn't, and these guys will just continue to be available because it's maybe the most heavily developed position in college now. Nick, what do you think?
Yeah, so just fast forward to 2019, and again, like a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about the analytics community getting right are like around this time period. I think like since then, it's kind of the league is caught up, and they haven't really had as many like great discoveries in the past couple of years. But I think around 2019, they kind of had the right idea about the wide receiver position, and the game was moving more towards it, and the league hadn't really caught up to that yet. And so you had players like A.J. Brown and DK Metcalf and even Terry McLaurin, the PFF had first-round grades on. And it was because like we saw traits, like guys like Odell Beckham Jr., like translating out of college, things like yak yardage being important, not being kind of prioritized in scouting. And like the main thing people scouted in receiver play up to that point was like, how good are your hands? And that, and route running was still a thing too. Like that was important, but I think the importance of like how well you catch a football was so much more valued at that time than like all these other things that we're looking at now. So you had a lot of players, including Debo, that I think don't even come close to touching day two these days than they would have in 2019. And I think you were seeing the adjustment now. Like, those guys just got paid. And since then, you've seen a lot of first round receivers being taken every year after. And we're going to start seeing like the domino effect of these guys getting paid as time goes on, guys like Jamar Chase and Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith in that draft as well, right? So I still think that the adjustment from that is because we're getting better at scouting the position, you're starting to see those guys get taken earlier. It's not as easy to find these excellent receivers on day two. I think like day two receivers that have gone since then are guys like Amari Rodgers, who's kind of more of like a punt returner type. You're like hoping explodes into a slot player. Guys like David Bell, who aren't as athletic, but might have like the technical skill in the hands. You're seeing kind of that division occur now. Now, I actually think tackle and corner is a position group too that, generally you find the better players at the top of the first round. But unlike pass rushers, you see a lot more day two guys at tackle, at corner, get taken and end up being really good. Guys like David Bakhtiari, right? Can really become like Hall of Fame level tackles if they have the right developmental traits, you put them in the right system. I think the difference with edge and D-line is we have been so good at scouting that position group that like the thing with quarterback is it is a demand thing. That's what pushes them up the board. I don't think D-line is pushed up the board because of demand. I think it's pushed up the board because it's generally just an easy, checkbox for GMs to get right.
Okay. That's an interesting point, I'm looking at it. 2014, 5 wide receivers went first round. 2015, 6 wide receivers went first round. 2017, another 5 went first round. And most of those guys didn't hit. Mm-hmm. So I think that teams became a little bit more weary drafting guys early, and that's why you saw the drop off in 2018 and 2019. And then it started to pick back up again. I mean, 2019, we had only 2 go first round. 2020, that's when you start to see the run coming back. I mean, Henry Ruggs, Jerry Jeudy, CeeDee Lamb, Jalen Reagor, Justin Jefferson, Brandon Ayuk, and then T. Higgins went with the first pick of the second round. So you saw 7 guys go in the first 33 picks. And then we know how it happened from there. Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith, Kadarius Toney, Rashad Bateman, and then Elijah Moore goes with the second pick of the second round. So we start to see it turn around already. I mean, last year, Drake London, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Jameson Williams, Jahan Dotson, Traylon Burks all go first round. So you get another 5 first round guys.
We're almost
and those guys have all
really
really
impact. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think, we've seen some good impact from receivers in the past few years that have gone highly. That is definitely true. And so, so the question is, in that stretch where we saw all of these great receivers in 2014 come out and make immediate impacts, were teams just pushing guys up the board because they wanted to replicate that? Is that what happened? Because, you had Mike Evans, you had Odell Beckham, you had I forget, there was the other guys then too, and then you look beyond in 2015. I think 2015 was the DeAndre Hopkins year where
I mean,
or
you
was
really
it?
had,
I forget, but
it was Hopkins. You had the kid from UCF. Perriman was like a really high pick. But I think what happened was you had this period where you had Beckham and you had Antonio Brown, who were really good players, and they were kind of outliers because the good receivers were Julio, Mike Evans, DeAndre Hopkins, Michael Thomas for a little bit, and he got drafted earlier than a lot of guys were talking about. Even Josh Gordon, like big possession guys, right? And I think the league saw that and was like, we're going to take, the N'Keal Harry's, or Corey Davis's, or we're going to take a guy that's smaller, it's going to be a Marquise Hollywood Brown who's just like a deep threat. Which isn't a bad thing, but it was thought of as the safe, we're not going to take a big receiver. He better be able to run. Whereas in reality, I think the explosion of Brown and Beckham's game was maybe more of a direction of where the league was going.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point too. And so, I'm curious to see how teams react this year, because we know that they want receivers, right? We know they've prioritized the position, and a lot of guys have gone in the first round lately, but this year, there just isn't that group of guys who are that kind of impact player day one, right? So does that mean that JSN actually gets pushed up even more than we think? Because as far as I'm concerned, he's really the only guy who's going to be that kind of day one impact. Yeah. And then everybody else, do they get pushed up, or is the league a little wiser, a little more patient? Do they sit and do they stay, in the late first round moving into the second round, right? And then are we looking at those guys being good players who get good contracts down the line, but just didn't make that immediate impact that you want from those picks? But let's flip the conversation over to the other side of the ball in a direct correlation. Let's talk about cornerbacks, right? So I know that tackle technically is a little bit more valuable here from a contract perspective, right? You're paid a little bit more, and corners are behind them. But I wanted to have this flip side conversation where there are less guys who are getting this elite money. Like the drop off in terms of compensation is a little bit more rapid for corner. But at the same time, you also look and you see who makes up the top of that list. It's Jair Alexander, Denzel Ward, Jalen Ramsey, Marlon Humphrey, Marshawn Lattimore, Xavier Howard, Tre'Davious White. And you got J.C. Jackson, Carlton Davis. Then you got Darius Slay, Marcus Peters. So, when you look at those guys, the majority of them are first round picks, and a couple that are not are still top 40 guys, right? So we're talking about on the edge, and I tend to still consider if you being taken in the top 40, you're essentially a first round pick, probably to at least a number of teams. That's where they had you pegged. So this position, it is challenging to scout, I think, to some degree, but we know that traits are really, really important. And so I think that if you don't have them, you don't get it done. But at the same time, if these our first round picks are the ones who are consistently getting contracts, maybe we do kind of know what we're looking for a little bit more out of these guys. If we're not getting random players who are developing out of the third, fourth, fifth round as often. I mean, there's a few guys. There's the Charvarius Ward in there, but they're fewer and far between than you would think. So what is it about the cornerback position that leaves a less robust market than some of the others? Because like I said, we've had some guys reset the market, but they're not all bunched up at the top in the way they are for some of these others. And again, how come we're so consistently finding those guys in the first round become the highly paid players?
So this is a really complex issue, I think, because I don't have like a straight answer for you other than I think there are a couple like small things that go into it. It's a really hard position to scout. You don't get enough snaps of these guys like impacting the game to like really get an idea of what they're looking at, right? So yes, first round corners tend to hit, but the hit rate is closer to quarterbacks than edge players, right? Like you miss on a lot of these first round guys too, and they just don't ultimately get paid. That's why you see a lot of like $10 million corner contracts where teams kind of buy low and see what they could end up being. And then, they might end up actually being quite good if they have the traits and end up in the right system. It's very system dependent. You have to take a guy that fits in what you're doing. So generally like teams like to stick to the consensus board and take like corner 3 when they're in the slot to take the third best corner. But corner 3 might not be as good of a system fit as corner 5. And so even though corner 5 is not as good of a player, he might be more impactful for you. So what's the trade-off there? And I think this position is kind of unique in that situationally, because I think you see more correlation between body type and skill set to scheme in this position, maybe to any other position, maybe outside of offensive line. But even with offensive line, I think it's easier for those guys in some cases to like transition over the course of time. And they have more time. I think they need more time to develop than corners. Corners, I think, we're asked more often to step in and play well, because if you need one, generally you're so bad on the back end, like it's a problem and you're like losing games because of it. Not that
I was about to say everybody needs them too. There's 5. You need minimum 6 corners now.
Mm-hmm.
You need 6 corners that you can play on the field now. So I think that's another thing that goes into it. You have so many guys that you need to have that skill set and this ability. You need 6-7 corners on the roster that you can play.
Mm-hmm. And going off of that, the reason that that's occurring, other than the fact that it's just like more important with the passing game expanding, is this is the most injured position in the NFL. People don't realize it. And it's like, yeah, I think maybe offensive linemen have like worse injuries when they get hurt because their impact, it's like they will be out for a longer period of time.
Right.
But corners have a lot more like cutting
Soft
and then
tissue,
soft tissue, and then you're out for like 6 weeks. You are almost certainly going to spend 6 to 8 weeks of your season missing your corner 1 or corner 2, regardless of what team you are. So you need to have a fourth guy who can step in and play well. And so I think that's why paying these guys is difficult, because, it's a very variable position that if you have a really good player, 6 out of 8 seasons, they play well. And on top of that, 2 of those 6 seasons, they probably missed half of those games, which is extremely difficult to navigate from a contract perspective.
Well, I think the other thing that I want to throw out there as far as that goes is if you are operating with a top tier corner, the way that you play coverage, relies heavily on that player. As soon as they're not available, you have to completely change the way you do things if you don't want to get torched, right? Whereas with offensive line, there may be some truth to that, right? You may be comfortable leaving your tackle on an island if he's your top tackle. If you're less likely to miss him for a substantial part of the year, maybe you're more willing to invest that money. Maybe you are more comfortable, with a big contract there, because you're like, if we lose him, things really change, but we're less likely to actually lose him, right? Or if he does have injuries, like maybe he's able to effectively play through that a little bit better. With corner, if you have a hamstring, maybe your season's not done, but like it sure as heck affects the way that you're able to cover guys down the field. So, I think, it is an interesting conversation as far as corners go. What do you think, Kyron? I mean, when you got these guys, what is it that you prioritize in terms of the draft? Like, we see these guys going high. A lot of them are even second round picks outside of the top 40 who make this up. So what is it that you're looking for in terms of a player that you're taking in the first or early second round?
All right, there's the outliers like the Stingleys and the Sauces that you think can be good regardless of scheme. Other than that, those can't miss guys, and we all thought that those guys were going to be taken in the top 5, and they were. Other than that, I'm drafted for scheme fit and scheme fit only, because that's what you're going to need. Like, I think it's going to be a travesty when Clark Phillips falls to like the 50th, 60th, maybe 70th pick, because people aren't evaluating guys properly. Like, that is the guy that's going to be a scheme fit for a lot of teams. I even look at guys like Elias Ricks. If you're talking about traits and stuff that you think you can like mold into a good player, Elias Ricks has all the traits in the world that you're going to want, and he's probably not going to go till halfway through the second round. I mean, I've heard a lot of stuff that he's, rising up boards really fast. I know he had a really good pro day. He ran unofficially at 4.39 and jumped 41 inches. So he had some really, he's obviously a physical freak. But he was in the doghouse this year at Alabama. You're going to see guys like that fall. That I just think people overthink the quarterback position a little bit as well. Like, there's no reason the guy with Tariq Woolen's elite traits and the way he tested last year and matched with the film that he had last year should fall to, I believe he went in the 5th round. Then you look at Kobe Bryant, he wins the Thorpe Award. He has all the tools and the trait measurables. Like, he's maybe not a straight line fast as you would want some of these guys, but everything else, his agility was great, his film was great, his size is great. He falls to the 4th round and ends up being a starter for a playoff team. Like, I think you're starting to see it a little bit more, though. The later guys start to hit a little bit. Just from last year in the draft, you got Brian Cook, he's a safety, but you start to see a lot of the DBs go later in the draft and have immediate impact. And I think you'll probably continue to see that. I think Nick said it. I think people are just getting better at evaluating the position all across the board. I mean, there's a million Nick Merriamans in offices right now somewhere watching film 12 hours a day, sending notes back to these. No, but I'm serious. Like, there's an entire analytic departments filled with guys and just scouting guys that do what Nick loves to do. He's watching film, he's writing notes, and there's 10 of them per position group now. Like, the scouting stuff is crazy. I have a couple of friends that are getting into it now, and I just couldn't imagine getting into that field because they're like relentless grinders. It's something I haven't seen in a long time. So, and I mean, you broke down for SIS. I mean, I know you were grinding with that. So you got to think about having that type of asset, those type of guys for every position group, and then just get to spend more time evaluating these players. So I think you're seeing a lot of that with DB now. I don't think that the pay is going to reflect it, though. I don't think these guys are going to be getting paid anymore. We've seen it a little bit with Chauncey this offseason. We all thought he was going to get a really nice deal, and allegedly he turned down more money from the Eagles. But we thought he was going to get a really, really nice deal. He ends up only getting, $8 million a year on the market? I mean, you see the elite guys get paid, but other than that, I don't think you're going to start seeing the pay disparity change at all. There's always going to be that rapid drop-off here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's also a major difference between guys who play consistent outside corner and guys who play like nickel or even safety hybrids, because
interesting, because I think there's way more value in what Kader Kehu did for Miami this year than say I don't want to throw any specific names out, but guys that are just out there on, but because it's just so interesting because I think there's so much more value in what a kid like that can do that can move everywhere. You can use them in multiple packages. And then say a guy that's just playing, on an island the whole game that isn't really getting a ton of targets. And I'm not talking about Sauce here because Sauce is not the guy. I know a lot of people think I just hate Sauce, but I don't. But Sauce is incredibly valuable for what he does. And he had too many pass breakups. He was too active in the game-to-game basis for me to like use him as the example. But I think there's so much value what a guy like that did. And Kader went in the 6th round, I believe. And I think he was one of the better cornerbacks in the league, especially if we're talking about guys that the expectation of what they were supposed to do. So I think there's so much more value, and I don't know if teams view it that way.
Well, I think the challenge, so this is another interesting conversation. The challenge is to find a player who, yeah, you might be able to move him around, but also there's more than likely if he's an inside player, just because of the way that team structure defenses and where guys try and play if they have the ability, because it's where they get paid, you are more than likely to be lacking something as a nickel or nickel safety hybrid in terms of size or speed or change of direction or ball skills or something. Because it's really, really hard to be big enough to match up with tight ends or big slots and also be small enough and shifty enough to match up with guys who are the Hunter Renfros, who are Elijah Moores, who are whoever is that if you want to put Jalen Waddle in the slot, right? Like, it's really, 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 really hard to find a guy who could do all of those things. Whereas if you are good enough and big enough to play against the Mike Evans outside, you're probably also good enough to play against, whoever else outside. You're probably good enough to play against, who's a big tight end. If you put Kyle Pitts out there, right? Like, it's not really changing your ability. If you're out there, you're probably, and you're good enough, you're probably able to cover any of those guys. Inside, it's just harder because you can be exploited, or maybe in the run game. As soon as they get you locked into that package where your nickel guy is out there, they start running the ball at you if they're good enough at it. It's tough to find a player who's viable in all facets of the game there. And I think that's really the biggest reason those guys don't end up making tons of money. And guys who are like the Kyle Hamiltons of the world end up getting drafted relatively highly because they might just be that guy who can kind of do everything. Now, is he going to match up with maybe Jalen Waddle? I don't know about that, but the point is the point is that, you know, he is more likely to be able to do it all. He can play against the run, he can play in coverage, you know, versus the bigger guys, and he's probably going to be able to match up against some of the shiftier guys, just, you know, by maximizing the strength and length and instincts that he has. So it's just hard to find guys who can do it all. You know, Nick, what would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the nickel thing we've talked about in previous episodes, and I think the difficult part about that position is we're still figuring out like what it is. A lot of teams are still drafting like the old slot corner and hoping that guy can work, and that's kind of what Kader Kohu is. He does it really well. But we're kind of seeing a lot of this like big nickel safety types with Kyle Hamilton, who are just like box players that can drop out and cover if you need them to. And I think we're going to have a period of you know, half a decade at least where we're looking at different teams doing that differently. And we might talk about like how nickel packages, which are becoming the base packages, look separately with different types of slot players specifically. But, you know, the demand for that position is high right now. Like, it's hard to find that type of guy. That being said, like, it's hard to find the outside guys too. And generally, like, those guys are matching up against the better receivers. But then we're seeing offenses kind of shift to putting the Justin Jefferson and the Cooper Kupps in the slot. And Cooper Kupp has this awesome season. People call him the best receiver in football. But in reality, like, the best corner he went up against was Byron Murphy. And like, it's like, it's such a fast changing position group that I think it's really difficult to pick out exactly what is valuable outside of just like good play and traits and production right now. And as Kyron talked about, I think scheme fit is probably being undervalued by a lot of these front offices. And I think, you know, this year is interesting because we have a lot of corners. We talked about Witherspoon. We talked about Deontay Banks, you know, being guys who can play outside and in the slot. And I think you're going to want to bring these guys in and start them out on the slot and see how they impact your defense. And if they're really good there, you might keep them there. But if you think that maybe they should move outside, you know, it depends on the defensive coordinator. It depends on the situation. All this stuff is so like nuanced.
Probably why I wouldn't be shocked if the Eagles took a corner to put him in the slot. You know, they have their outside guys.
That's what we talked about. Like, just draft Witherspoon and have him play slot. He did that a ton at Illinois. And like, effectively, like, when you're playing like that off man coverage, like, that's a thing that translates a lot to like whatever in the NFL. And Illinois did that. So, you know, I just think this is a very complex position to scout that we are still figuring out, as Kyron had said.
Question for you though, a guy like Brian Branch, I've heard a lot of people talk about him basically being a nickel corner.
Yeah.
What do you think about a guy like that who played primarily safety, split safety in college, come down to be a corner, essentially the fifth guy on the defense? So I think that would be interesting to me, like strictly playing him as a nickel corner.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because like I would call Kyle Hamilton and Kader Kohu like different types of players, and Branch is probably more in the Kyle Hamilton realm of player, despite being closer to Kohu like physically. So you might call that guy a corner, you might call him a safety, but it is a different position, right? And I think Branch's skill set, though he played kind of the deep safety position, what he does well might more fit that position specifically. And I think that's what happened with Hamilton too. Like, he was playing deep half a lot. And then he gets to the NFL and the Ravens are like, you fit better as a slot guy. And that effectively, when the league effectively is like faster and you're surrounded by more athletes, it made more sense for him to make that transition. And I think that's probably going to end up being the case with Branch too.
So this is really interesting. And let's just slide right into the safety conversation because it just seems apropos. When you look at the safety market and the top guys who are paid there, you've got a few of these guys who are high draft picks, right? You got Derwin James, Minka Fitzpatrick, Jamal Adams, Harrison Smith. But, you know, most of these guys are not that because of how we viewed the safety position for years and years and years. But another thing is that a lot of these guys are relatively available in free agency or even in trade without major compensation. So when you look at that and you're like, okay, I want to get a player who impacts my defense, you know, Jesse Bates, free agent, Justin Simmons, I think he was a 5th round pick, maybe 3rd round pick. So Justin Simmons is a 3rd round pick. Eddie Jackson, maybe he was a 5th round pick.
He went later. He was coming off ACL too, so I think that messed up his value. But interesting.
Yeah, but you know,
was Poyer a free agent?
Poyer was a free agent.
Okay.
You know, Poyer was a free agent. I mean, he's extended, but he was a free agent. You know, Budda Baker, I believe he was a second round pick. Kevin Byard, I think he was a later, maybe second round pick as well. Third round pick, right? So, you know, there's all varying ranges where these guys come in. Justin Reed, I mean, Amani Hooker, Micah Hyde, you know, Tyrann Mathieu. And again, maybe he's had other things, but I'm not sure he would ever have been a first round pick regardless, just due to size. Rayshon Jenkins, Tracy Walker, Vaughn Bell, Marcus May, Jordan Whitehead, Donovan Wilson. I mean, aside from a couple of guys at the top, a lot of these guys were later picks or available in free agency or available in trade. Quandre Diggs was a trade, but not for a whole heck of a lot of compensation. And so, you know, we understand that, you know, a weak link at safety is just a weak link in your coverage unit, and it's a weak link position group. So if you have a guy who can't get it done, you're probably not going to have a very good defense. But when you realize where these guys are available, does it make it hard to prioritize them in the first round? Because again, there's just players you just can't get elsewhere, or at least extremely unlikely to. So where do we prioritize safety? Do we say, let's wait on it, let's hold off? Brian Branch is great, but maybe we just don't need Brian Branch if we can find Jesse Bates in free agency. Maybe we don't need Brian Branch if we can trade a whatever pick for Quandre Diggs to come over here, right? Like, where is that player good enough that it forces our hand and we just have to take him in the first round over other positions?
We talked about this a little bit last week. I feel like the top of the corner and safety market in free agency is, again, like really not a place I want to be, because generally that's where like the record-making deals tend to be. And there's a lot of guys that are like changing systems where they were already playing well, right? And it's continuity-wise like not great for them. We saw this with J.C. Jackson last year. I don't know how Jesse Bates is going to look in Atlanta. I hope he plays well. I don't know. We'll see. I mean, he's making $16 million a year, so he better, right? The problem is a lot of these like you find players like the Kendall Fullers of the world in Washington and like the the Marcus Epps of the world going over to the Raiders, who are like decent players who have been in systems where they were good, and then the system changes, and then they look not as good, and then they end up becoming free agents because of it, and then you can buy them for like somewhere in the $7 to $9 million range, and they're really good players at important position groups. And that's why I think you see some, especially the safety position, getting pushed down draft boards. It's not because, you know, secondary play isn't valuable. It's extremely valuable to have good safeties. I still think safety is more valuable than linebacker in today's NFL, but the problem is linebackers are a little less scheme dependent. And I think if you find a guy that's really good, like you're like, oh man, we have to lock this guy down because there's not that many of these players. And safety, you can just pay relatively cheap contracts in the open market to get a guy that's a good player. And it's because of that schematic thing that I think a lot of teams are messing up.
Also, yeah, but I mean, if that's the case, sorry, go ahead, Karen.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that if that's the case, if all these guys who are getting top of the market money or near to are not really difference makers, exactly how many difference makers at the position do we even have in the NFL, right?
Thank you.
Derwin James,
that point.
Minkah Fitzpatrick. I mean,
we're coming off the golden age. We're coming off the golden age of safety play too. I think that teams are a little spoiled in the type of players that we from 2005 on. I mean, think about all the Hall of Fame safeties that we had play in the NFL all the way up. So I think Earl Thomas, when he started to kind of decline a little bit, I think you saw a little bit of the drop off and like elite safety play. But we had an all-time run there on safety play for about 15 years right there. So I think teams are a little spoiled. If you're not that type of guy, I don't think you're going to get taken very high. And we saw Minkah, the Derwins. Those were guys that we thought had those same type of makeups and that same type of ability that you just couldn't miss. And it translated very well. So I think that's the thing. You see the guys. When you see them, you know. And we're coming off a golden age of those type of guys.
For sure.
Well, I think we kind of know what we're looking for in terms of physical profile for safeties, right? Viable safety. You know, you run in what, like 4.4s to 4.5-ish. You know what I mean? Maybe around 200 pounds. And, you know, if you're a relatively intelligent player, then, you know, you're probably going to be pretty decent. If you're a little less athletic, but you're more, you have more savvy, you can still be effective. You know, if you're very athletic and you have that then
Right.
you could be that kind of guy. But then a lot of times those guys end up being corners, right? Because if you're physically, you meet that threshold, and you're probably trying to be on the outside. So there's just so few guys. To me, I think Minkah Fitzpatrick is so clearly the best safety in the NFL. I don't think it's even close. I think he's like the number one guy, and everybody else has like some relative limitation to their game. I think Derwin James is probably the closest second, but again, he's kind of, he has a lot of injury issues, and he plays a super
Let's be
physical
honest, they use him like a
style, but his
linebacker
body
most of the
doesn't hold
time.
up. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, and he's very good at it, but he's also not the biggest guy, so he gets hurt a lot, and he makes a lot of splash plays. But I just think what Minkah Fitzpatrick does is it's just there's nobody else that's on par with him, at least not that I can think of off the top of my head. Would you dispute that in any way, Nick?
I think what you guys are talking about is like when we talk about the golden age of safety plays, it's a position that affects the game like down to down less than any other because they're the furthest from the ball. So in order for a safety to really impact the game, they have to be forcing turnovers, getting sacks, like literally highlight level plays, like and multiple of them in a game. And Minkah is the only guy who's really done that over the course of multiple seasons. And then we're starting to see guys like later in drafts who like put up seasons like Josie Bates had a year where he's all over the place. This year, Derek Force Jr., who I did not have any expectations to do anything for Washington. He's a special teamer. Has a year where he is just a complete ball hawk and is making like ridiculous interceptions and forcing fumbles. And is he going to do that again for the rest of his career? I don't expect it, but that is the type of player that you need to have in order for safeties to make the contracts that put them on that Ed Reed, Troy Polamalu, Sean Taylor level, right? And we just haven't seen it because I think the game is moving in a direction where, we're attacking the sidelines a lot more. When we run the ball, we're kind of relying more on the linebackers to come up and deal with that and have the safeties make sure that they don't get beat deep. We're playing effectively more safe versions of football. I think that the rules with hits have kind of eliminated kind of the coming across and crushing the receiver thing, which has kind of was more of a highlight reel thing than really impacted the game. But it's different game now, and it's the adjustment has to occur on the field in order to understand exactly what we're looking for in terms of that position still.
So if that's the case, then let's circle back again and say, if this player affects the down-to-down play less than anybody else, then how can we realistically talk about Brian Branch being a top 15 pick? How does that make any sense?
Because the roster is already so good. I mean, it's the fit, right? There's certain guys.
That's a mistake because you can just get cheaper somewhere else, right?
I think
not if he's that impactful.
I think
because he has versatility as well. He doesn't just have to play. He's not just a guy that you can peg and you have to peg in one position. He gives you scheme versatility. He gets to do whatever you want to do with him. He's a guy that can be on the field all three downs, and you don't have those type of guys in the NFL right now. You just don't.
This is going to be really silly, but cyclical nature of things, right? Everything is moving away from the ball, and so we've popped the new position right next to it, which is the slot corner, right? That is now the safety that is going to be valuable. I think you're going to see more of these I used Jaquan Johnson or whatever as an example, or whatever the Indiana player was that popped up late in the draft and went 5th round and was a deep free safety a couple years back. Mm-hmm. Those guys that just cover the deep half and effectively keep everything in front of them, we're going to see kind of get less and less valuable. And we're going to see an emphasis on these nickel corners because I do think if you're covering the slot, you're impacting the game more often because you are closer to the ball. You are covering a guy in their face. And when you need to get involved in the run game, you are crashing down into the box as a part of the fit. That's different than what we've been drafting in previous years.
So that's so funny because nickel corner for a while was the least compensated starting position in the entire NFL. Because once we translate, kind of moved away from this three, whatever defense you're running, if you're running a 4-3, once we transition away from using that third linebacker and base package, really, or if you're an odd front, then you move away from that, having that 5th lineman or however you want to talk about it. However you want. Once you translated to having nickel as a base, without fail, nickel corners were the least compensated at the top of the market, right? Most of them were making $10 million per year at most. Slot receivers even were doing a little better than that. Julian Edelman and the guys at the top. So if that's the case, if we are saying we should only be taking a safety in the first round, if we expect him to be a nickel coverage box type guy, then that's a major swing in a different direction, right? So we're going to have to see how that plays out. We're going to have to see who can effectively make that transition on a regular basis and if they're going to be big enough and fast enough, and et cetera.
And it's important to note that it's not you just call it like nickel box. Like it's the idea is that the initial single high looks we had like back in the early 2000s where you would have, an Earl Thomas playing the free safety spot and a Cam Chancellor playing the box position. And we've kind of moved to where we have two like deep halves.
Right.
The nickel guy is like a hybrid of both. You have to be
Right.
able to play both positions. And that's what's important here.
Got to be physical
I'll be
enough to
interested
take
to
on the tight ends in the run game and stuff too.
And I'll be
And
interested to see how these new guys get paid here, like the Hufangas of the world. In another year, the Jalen Petries of the world. I'll be interested to see how these guys get paid, if they're going to get paid top dollar, because you see a guy like Hufanga, he took that defense to another level. They've always been a really good defense, right? But his playmaking ability, his ability to go impact the run game, be a ball hawk in the passing game. Even sometimes he's a little too aggressive. He would give up a couple of big plays here and there, but the plays that he made 1,000% overrode that, and he became an All-Pro this year. So it's like you look at guys like that, and even the guys like Petrie, who had like incredible numbers this past season. I think he's going to maybe see a drop off in the numbers, but be just as impactful, or maybe even more impactful with D'Amico Ryans coming over. And you're going to see guys like that become extremely valuable here. So I'll be interested to see how those guys get paid, and if we start to see guys like those get taken higher in the draft.
I may have mentioned it earlier on the show, but I do know another guy, a guy who's kind of a hybrid type, Cam Curl. Looking for a lot of money. So,
listen, and he deserved, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I know that's your team, so you're probably like, but I mean, Javon Holland's gonna break the bank here soon in Miami. I mean, you have to start paying these guys. They're extremely valuable. A little bit different conversation here because they're not really playing like the nickel position, but they have the versatility where you can move these guys all over the field. They're impactful in the run game. They're ball hawks in the passing game. They just have so much value, and I think you're going to start seeing these guys get paid more, or at least I hope so, because their play warrants it, in my opinion.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about offensive line here, right? And this is a multifaceted conversation because we have a bunch of different positions that are all lumped in at times. It's actually pretty funny that the way the franchise tag works on multiple levels is kind of ridiculous, but in particular offensive line, because it's like there's just one franchise tag for every offensive line position, when in reality we genuinely have 5 different offensive line positions. So left tackle has been the most highly compensated of any offensive lineman forever and a day. It's just always been that way. The gap between left and right is not closed, but the disparity is less notable. Currently, the most well-compensated player at left tackle is Laramie Tunsil at about $25 million per year. There's a gap to a couple of million down to David Bakhtiari. Trent Williams, he's not really making 23.01. That's not really a real number. He's making closer to like 20 million. I forget the exact number, but he's one of those inflated deals. Ronnie Stanley is making a legit 19.75. Jake Matthews making, I think, a legit 18.5. So, we got a couple of guys who cleared 20 million on the left side, and then a few guys who are directly underneath it. Then you look at the right tackle position, and you've got Lane Johnson, who's just cleared 20 million. And then you got Jawan Taylor, who just hit 20, although we talked about him probably getting moved to the left side. And then Ramczyk and Brian O'Neill at 19.2 and 18.5, relatively speaking. So we're not quite there, but that's closer than it's ever been. And I think that's – you want to say something, Kyron?
Well, I just think we're about to start seeing these guys break the bank here very, very, very soon. I mean, you look at the guys who come out the last 3 or 4 years. Panay Sewell's about to have one of the biggest deals we've ever seen at the position. Tristan Wirfs is going to have one of the biggest deals we've ever seen at the position. People don't talk about this guy, but he's definitely fringe elite and going. I think he's going to continue to keep working his way there. Christian Darrisaw in Minnesota, he's going to break the bank here very soon. He's going to get paid. Even going back to 2020, guys like Andrew Thomas, he's going to get paid very handsomely here. You're just going to start seeing Rashawn Slater after this season. He's going to break the bank as well. You're going to start to see a lot of these guys get paid closer to the Laramie Trent range, and I think they're going to start. You see the position value go way back up like it has been in the past. I think there's going to be a pretty big run here on the tackles.
Right. Well, I think so. I think we've got some good players who are ready to get paid, and the question is just how much does the market jump by? Is it just by a little bit? Sometimes it's by a tenth of a million. The next player gets his money, right? And sometimes it's a larger jump. I mean, the fact that Laramie Tunsil jumped up is a pretty good indicator. Laramie Tunsil has been driving the offensive tackle market for the past 6 years now. He has just single-handedly been elevating it. So that is pretty funny, and that's a conversation I'd love to get into another day, because that's really all about contract negotiations and leverage, and we don't have time for that. But I wanted to talk about tackles in the sense that they're getting paid pretty well here, and we also know that most of these guys are first-round picks or high picks, right? We got Laramie Tunsil, Trent Williams, David Bakhtiari, a total outlier there, but Ronnie Stanley, Jake Matthews, Colton Miller, Cam Robinson was a high second-round pick, Garrett Bowles, DJ Humphreys, Orlando Brown, again, kind of unusual situation because of the athletic testing, but his tape is better than that probably. And then Jordan Mailata is coming over from playing a different sport in a different country. So, but then even as you roll down, then you got Taylor Decker and so on. So, you got primarily highly drafted players at left tackle, and then right tackle was different for a while, but now we're starting to see again, Lane Johnson, Jawan Taylor, high second-round pick, Ryan Ramczyk, Brian O'Neill, high second-round pick, Mike McGlinchey, first-round pick, Braden Smith, high second-round pick, Taylor Moton, high second-round pick, Jack Conklin, so Caleb McGarry. So, the difference between where these guys are getting drafted is no longer first round versus second, third, fourth round, fifth round. It's now first round, maybe versus late first round, early second round, right? So, we're prioritizing both of these positions, and there's maybe more versatility with these players who could probably play either side, because we're asking more in pass protection from these guys who play the right side now. So we're getting more ambidextrous, really, as offensive line, as we look at the offensive line in the NFL. So when you're looking at tackle in particular, Nick, what is it that you're needing to see in the draft? Where is it that you want to prioritize these guys, and how important is it for you to have two of these guys? I think is an important question too.
It's really important, and I think it's this is another position group, and all these have these weird details to them, where you're going to draft tackles the most because tackles are the most important position, right? But if they mess up and you need to move them, they're going to end up playing guard. And in my opinion, and I don't think everyone agrees with, some people go tackle guard center. Some people go tackle center guard. Some people think it's left tackle, right guard center, which is I don't know. I tend to think that the center position is generally something that is more valuable on its own because of how involved they are with calls than guards. So you need to find that centerpiece, but generally you're not going to draft the center, and if he doesn't work out, move him to guard. He has to be able to play that position. There aren't that many guard centers as there are guard tackles. So, you have to be able to kind of on the fly adapt your O-line correctly, figuring out where I think Washington had a ton of issues this year in terms of Sam Cosmi, was a good right tackle year one, really struggled this past season. They were moving him back and forth, literally week to week guard tackle. The guy's pissed because he doesn't know what position he's playing. And you don't want that. That's just really bad for your long-term development for multiple reasons. Even so, I think it's important to have an idea of what a guy is and can be, but teams need to be more willing to commit to changing the position of these players and then stick with it and just let it happen. Because although we're hoping all these guys can step in and play great right off the bat, a lot of them don't, especially at this position group. Generally, the best play you see from these guys is in year 2, year 3. Darisaw, for an example, is a guy who had an injury, but even when he was playing last year, early on, he was good, not great. And then this season, he was awesome. Andrew Thomas, another example of that, struggled year 1, awesome year 2, and even better this season, was an all-pro player, right? So, it is a highly valued pick position. You should be taking it early. You should be taking it late. You should be looking all over the place. There are guys that have stepped in like Braxton Jones who have played well out of the 5th round because they have traits. Some guys are really traitsy and doesn't look like it works at the college level. And they get to the NFL and they just get a couple of technical pieces of advice and it just works, Again, another position group that I think is more along the lines of corner than edge, in that it is, we know what we're looking for, but it's hard to specifically point out what works for each individual prospect.
So
Yeah.
go ahead, Kyron. I want you to have your chance to talk O-line.
Well, there's another thing like to keep in mind when we're talking about positional value here. Offensive linemen tend to play a pretty long time in the NFL. So you think about guys like Bakhtiari. Lane Johnson just got paid again. I look at the guy like in Miami, like Teron Armstead. People talk about how big Tyreek Hill was. Obviously, we're not downplaying Tyreek's value, but getting Teron Armstead to play left tackle was absolutely just as important as getting Tyreek Hill to help open up that offense. I mean, and you're going to see a guy like that. I mean, even though he's been out with some injuries, he's been banged up a lot. You have to pay a guy like that coming up. I mean, you think he's 32, 33 years old, but he's going to get another contract here very soon, and you have to pay a guy like that because he's that good. I thought he should have been, second team All Pro this year. So when you look at guys like that, and they're a little bit older in age, maybe we see a bigger run on guys like that getting paid, and then you take some more developmental guys later in the draft and try to piece it around. I don't know if we'll continue to see like this draft. I think there's a lot of good tackle prospects in this draft, but there's not a lot of can't miss guys that you have to take in the top 10. But you talk about like
guys,
tackle,
I'm going to
talk about that.
Pass the conversation over to you for just a minute. I'll be back in a second.
Gotcha. But you look in this draft, I think there's a ton of right tackle prospects. I mean, if your team that needs a right tackle, you got Darnell Wright, you got Matthew Bergeron, you got Jalen Duncan, you got Dawan Jones. Even guys that I'm not as high on, but I think he has a lot of traits. We talk about traits. Blake Freeland out of BYU. I mean, you talk about a guy that has athletic ability, natural size that you can't teach. There's a huge run of guys like that that I don't think we're going to see get taken very, very high, but have the chance to come in and play at a high level early and be plug and play right tackles. I think you're starting to see a lot more right tackle become a point of interest here because a lot of teams have they have their bookend left tackle. Most teams do. They're paying their guys. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how many of those guys go late first round, early second round, because I think there's a big run on guys like that. And I think you'll continue to see the older guys get paid more to play left tackle.
Yeah, when you talk about age, it's an interesting thing because I think this is a unit that is extremely unique for team building aspect, both in that, like, you can invest in a guy. If you find a guy that's really good, you can have him for 20 years. Like, he could be a really good player for you for a long time. But also in that you have to kind of complete the unit. There's a saying that's like, this is a weak link unit, and that you could have like 4 really solid, good players. But if you have like a third string guard playing, teams are just going to attack that guard and you're going to have problems. So you have to have backup plans for your backup plans here. And that's why I think you see some teams, more often than not now, like investing, in first round corners, receivers, edges, and then coming back and going like second, third, fourth, like all offensive line picks, because it's almost more valuable to have like 3, above average players than 1 like stud left tackle.
Yeah, agreed. And you look at like the weak link point that you just made. I thought Miami actually did a pretty good job of retooling that offensive line, but that right tackle spot was a sore spot for them all throughout the season, especially when Teron Armstead went out. You really saw the big difference because, Tua is a lefty. The right side is his blind side, but he was able to get the ball out quick, step up in the pocket, get the ball out. When Teron Armstead was out, you really saw the difference between how bad the right tackle was compared to the left tackle. So even a team like the Texans, who I think have done a really good job retooling that offensive line, everybody knows that they need a center. They need a center that's going to be able to step up, and I think that's why you'll see if they keep that pick. There's been some talk about trading up to get the first pick for Bryce, potentially. Who knows? But if they had that 36 pick still, and John Michael Schmitz is still on the board, I don't think it should be a debate. That should be the pick. That's who they should go to because it takes their offensive line from really good. I mean, you have Laramie Tunsil, Kenyon Green, who you invested a top 15 pick in last year, Scotty Quisenberry, who's not a bad player by any means, but if you could get a John Michael Schmitz to pair with Shaq Mason and then Titus Howard on the right side, you go from a good offensive line to one of the better units in the NFL. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that as well, plugging guys in at the weak spots and taking a shot on them earlier in the draft because we don't see a lot of centers go, top 50 in the draft. I mean, it just doesn't happen, but I think you're going to start seeing it a lot more. And as I think you're just starting to see value in the offensive line all across the board more. Look at how fast the Chiefs retool their offensive line, how fast the Lions retool their offensive line. It's becoming more of a focus point here in the draft, especially in that late first round, second round that you've been talking about where you're stashing up on guys.
Yeah. Again, going back to like kind of what we were saying before. If you're going to retool the group, you kind of need to have a focus where you're going to add multiple players. This is not a position group where you're going to add a tackle unless you're like Miami and you've kind of already been focusing on rebuilding the group. So you can just say like a piece will maybe help us. but like the Chiefs, the Bengals the year before, who really retooled that O-line, and still, like, I think they got better, but to get over that hump from being in, like, I kind of see it as like there are 3 tiers of offensive lines in the NFL. There's the good ones, there's like everybody in the middle who's like, you know, decent enough, and then there's like the really bad ones. The Bengals like kind of moved up towards that, like towards the middling group, but they're kind of at the back end, and like one more like solid player could really put them up towards the top of the NFL. And that's, you know, maybe even just like a better play in Orlando Brown on the left side might do that for them. Although I think they will probably draft the right tackle based on, you know, things I've heard from people I know who are fans of that team and or close to it, you know. But it's a multi-year project to retool that unit.
For sure. A team like the Jets as well. Because
that's
the Jets
true.
are like, go ahead, because you're the Jets guy. But I know a lot of people are saying go defense, but I'm like, bro, they need the offensive, they need a tackle for sure. And like you talk about versatility, a tackle that may be able to play right and left. That's why I think if Paris Johnson Jr. is there, you have to take a guy like that because he may be a guy that you could play on either side of the line.
You know, for the Jets, I mean, they've got paper starters, but you know, one guy gets hurt all the time. One guy's in his late 30s. Then they've got, you know, their swing tackle is a 4th round pick from last year who had blood clot and, you know, issues. So it's like, you know, you've got 3 guys who have all played well at certain times, but can you rely on any of them to necessarily play really well this year? I don't know about that. So that's a, you know, that's you know, a position that they should probably prioritize. And we talked about it, you know, they moved up to the 2nd round with their 3rd round pick because one of them is probably going to the Packers. So, you know, they'll have another high-ish 2nd round pick that they could use too if they really, you know, if they can't get one of those top guys in the draft there. But one of the things I wanted to talk about here is, you know, we want to make sure that we're prioritizing all 5 positions if you do need to rebuild it, if you want to improve there. But where do we go after centers? All right. So, like, you know, Kyron, you say the Texans, you know, you want to get that guy who's going to pair well with your rookie. You want to take the pressure off him a little bit. But just generally speaking, most of these centers who are paid at the top of the market, they're not 1st round picks. Most of them are not even 2nd round picks, to be perfectly honest. So if you're able to get these guys who are important due to their intelligence and their ability to make calls, you know, if they're not being put on islands in pass protection, you know, if you're not necessarily worried about that, then when can you wait to find an intelligent player who doesn't necessarily have elite athleticism that you can plug into the middle, who can take care of all the calls, who can make sure everything goes well, but is not necessarily, you know, 6'2", 310 pounds, right? Like maybe you don't need that. Maybe that's not that important. Who can, you know, move all over the place. So if you look at these guys like Chase Roulier, I mean, I'm not even sure where some of these guys are drafted, but you know, if you look at Chase Roulier, you look at, you know, 6th round, you look at Jason Kelsey, you look at Ryan Jensen, who was, what was it, 6th round. Like, where is the sweet spot for centers? Where can we wait to pick one of those guys up?
I think it's anywhere. I mean, it's just, if you feel good about a guy in a certain spot based on consensus, like you take him and it's fine. I think day 2 onward is generally where you're going to see those guys go. I think they're, you know, anything like these, you know, center, it should, you know, it's a position group that is below what the 2nd tier position we've already talked about. Like, it's not one that is essential. You have like an all-star center. It's essential that you have like a good enough center, but you know, if you have a Jason Kelsey, it does impact your football team, right? Like you can find, you know, just like tight end, just like linebacker, like there are rare occurrences where there are these like awesome all-pro players who really impact the football game and teams to worry about. So I think, you know, you have these Tyler Linderbaums that pop up, and it's like so very clear that that guy is an impactful player that he should go high in the draft, and that will occur. I think him going 25th last year was interesting to me because I think that there was like no chance that guy wasn't going to be an impactful football player, even in like not the right scheme last year. Like, I think he really helped the Ravens offense out. And I think I had him top 10 on my board. It was like 9th for me. I don't know if maybe that was a little high because someone, you know, put it to me like, where would you have taken Creed Humphrey if you knew what he was going to be? And I was kind of like, in the draft the year before, which was an awesome draft, I probably would have taken him in like the 15 to 18 range. So maybe he's like more in the early teens is where Linderbaum should have gone. But it's how good do you feel about a guy? Does the consensus agree? If they really like him, then maybe you take him higher than most, but often wise, it's going to be, outside of those top 40 picks, and you're going to find talented players. They're going to be there.
100% agree. And like you just said, I think the days of Creed Humphrey types going, I think he went with the second to last pick of the second round. I think those days are over. You see Linderbaum, he went first round. I think this year you're going to see John Michael Smith. I wouldn't be surprised if he sneaks into the first round. And I wouldn't even say it's sneaking into the first round. The position is that valuable. And then in the years to come, there's going to be a much larger run here. Seth Van Pran, in my opinion, is going to be I thought he would have been a first round pick this year if he were to come out from Georgia. I think you're going to see more of those center types start to go earlier and earlier in the draft. One, because we see how valuable they are. And two, matching the quarterback with the center has always been a big thing, but I think you're going to see it a lot more because we have a lot more young quarterbacks in the NFL. You're going to need those guys to pair with them. And the crop of centers now is starting to get a little bit older. I think the guy after Kelsey that I really, really like is Frank Ragnow, and he went first round in 2018 to the Detroit Lions. But you're going to start seeing more of those guys go earlier, I believe, because one, the position's getting better. They're more athletic. They're more physical road graders in the middle. They used to be like the center was the plug and play guy, like you said, didn't have to be a dog, but he was able to help a lot. You're getting a lot of 4 down fronts, and he's just going to be the chipper, and he's going to be the extra hand and pass protection. But I think you're going to see an emphasis on center play a lot more going forward, mainly because the guys are just better that are going to be coming through here, and you can't miss on some of these guys.
Yeah, I just there's a question to me of just, if I'm trying to maximize my roster, though, I have a tendency to lean towards players that I can't find in free agency, right? Like currently Ben Jones is still available in free agency, right? Pochich did end up going back to the Browns, but, he could have been had as a free agent. You've got Bradley Bozeman, who went to the Panthers and was able to help out, right? You had Corey Linsley go and be available to the Chargers, right? So it's like, for me, I don't want to diminish their value. It's just about, draft value, really. And again, it's just about where these guys are available elsewhere. Just makes me want to prioritize positions that I just can't find elsewhere, right? Like, do I want to? Maybe sometimes there's just a moment where it's just so clear that this player is so much better than everybody else that's still remaining who plays a more difficult to find position. But I just feel like it would be pretty challenging for me to sign up for that when I know that viable centers are available, in a myriad of different places. It's just, is there any pushback on that? I hear what you guys are saying, but it's like, yes, Tyler Linderbaum helped the team, but there were other players in the top 20 or, top 30 or top 40 who also help teams that are positions that are just harder to find. It's just, it's just about resource allocation, right? It's just,
I would argue that
opportunity
a Jason Kelsey type is not easy to find. That's the point of it, right? It's like, I think running backs makes this whole thing difficult because I think there are like more impact running backs, and that's why the demand is like different for that position than a tight end or like if you could find a Travis Kelsey, you're taking him with a top 5 pick, right? Like no one's like debating that. I think the same thing is the case with a Jason Kelsey. Like those guys don't exist. And a Fred Warner, right? Like those guys do not exist. They're hard to find. And if you find them, they impact your football team. You don't see guards really that are like, yeah, Quentin Nelson is like a really good football player. I don't know that I'd rather take him over a Jason Kelsey long-term for my franchise, right? Because I think, you can – the tough part of the conversation is because you have 2 guards and you have 1 center on a football field, there are more guards, but there's also like this whole thing about it's easier to find centers because, we don't have as many of impactful players. And then tackles become guards because they're athletes already, so then it works. I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion about those 2 positions, specifically center versus guard, going forward in the NFL. And I think, just because that I think that center is more important doesn't mean that's the right answer. I think some teams, clearly, as I said earlier, like they have different ideas on how to build your offensive line. It almost certainly goes tackle first, but the interior is a whole discussion on its own. And that's why I think we put interior offensive line in like one category. Is it's generally you can kind of put the centers up against the guards and whichever player's better you want to take.
I mean, I think I would love to continue that conversation really, but we're running short on time and we haven't talked about a number of positions here. So let's make the transition over to running back then. And ultimately here we're looking at a market that has completely stalled out. We're looking at a market that was set by Ezekiel Elliott and then beaten out by Christian McCaffrey. And then ever since then, no one has been able to top it, even the players who are currently more effective than either of them. Although I guess, aside from injuries, maybe it's hard to make the argument that someone's more effective than Christian McCaffrey. But either way, it hasn't even come close. Guys have gotten significantly less. Even good players are getting under $10 million per year because nobody's willing to invest there. We see guys go in the first round sometimes. Last one was 2 guys in 2021. Nobody went in the first round last year in 2022. We're looking at almost definitely Bijan Robinson going in the first round, but unless Gibbs slides in there, probably going to be the only one. And these guys also tend to see a significant drop off. They probably have the shortest shelf life of any position in the NFL in terms of efficacy. So, where is the sweet spot for running back? And do you draft one high and then just say we're going to run him until he can't run anymore, and then we just circle back? Or do you only draft guys highly that have a long-term impact where you have access to signing him to an extension long term? What do you feel about the running back position at this point, Nick?
I hate this discussion on Twitter because, you got players on there who are really upset about it because they know that they're very good athletes and valuable to the league to exist. Right. And that's the truth. These guys are awesome. We should totally be paying them and giving them their credit and selling their jerseys and, making a big deal about it. But it's not really their fault. The problem is at some point along the line, everyone started sticking the best athletes at running back. And it's not that these teams don't need running backs. It's that it's a simple supply demand problem. There are, 45 plus guys who can go into a system and, crank out 1,200 yards. It's tough because clearly there are some guys like Barkley and Derrick Henry and Nick Chubb that kind of set themselves on their own. But even that tier, I think, is a group of 6 or 7 guys that are really talented. And, if you have one of them, you feel pretty good about it. And there's not really another position group where I think, the style of those 6 or 7 at the top is so similar. I think the tag is interesting because it's worked for these teams in terms of getting these guys some money, but it's unfortunate because these guys are playing shorter careers where year to year their career could end and they're playing on these 1-year deals. It's kind of a crapshoot, this market right now. And I think that we kind of need to the league needs to figure out a way to fix it, whether it's going to be approaching the position differently, whether it's going to be coaching it in a way that allows them to, exist longer term, because you don't want these guys coming in and having these 5-year careers that are awesome and then not even getting a contract because, the league has decided it's just not worth it.
Right. Well, I think, you look at the statistics for running backs this year, right? How many guys cleared 1,000 yards? Maybe not that many, maybe not 45. But then here's the question: how many
teams did
guys?
That. Yeah.
Right. How many guys could clear 1,000 yards if they stay on the field the whole time behind the Chiefs O-line, behind the Eagles O-line, behind quality O-lines? You could probably put in a lot of different guys and have that kind of production. And the other thing is anybody disputing that there is an elite tier of running backs in the NFL? No. But how long are they elite for? Right? At what point does that change? And at what point does your offense completely fall off the rails if you base it around an elite running back and he's not available? And we kind of see that with the Giants a little bit last year. When he's the best player on your team, then you are pretty well out of luck if you don't have top tier quarterback and pass catchers. So, Karen, I know that you feel a certain kind of way about this, and I think ultimately it's just not fair. It's just not fair, but it's hard. You have to formulate a market somehow in some way. So, what is your response to all of that?
Well, I got into an argument with Kevin Cole. I think he's a PFF guy. He was talking about, where Bijan's value is. And we kind of started to talk about the first round running backs since 2010. So he named the guys. These are the first round running backs since 2010. C.J. Spiller, Mark Ingram, Trent Richardson, Doug Martin, David Wilson, Todd Gurley, Melvin Gordon, Ezekiel Elliott, Leonard Fournette, Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, Rashad Penny, Sony Michel, Josh Jacobs, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Najee Harris, and Travis Etienne. He used that as the argument to say why you shouldn't take guys early. And I thought that was just asinine because it's like, I responded, I was like, 11 of these 17 guys were either Pro Bowl players or all pros. And Leonard Fournette and Sony Michel, they never made a Pro Bowl or an all pro. But if you look at the Super Bowl runs for the Patriots and the Buccaneers that year, they were either the most important player or the second most important offensive player on those teams. And Rashad Penny is just a really good football player when he's healthy. And then the Eagles just showed a vote of confidence in him and letting, they let Miles Sanders go to, I believe, Carolina is where Miles Sanders landed. But they replaced him with one of those guys. So I said, out of those 17 guys, only 2 or 3 of those guys are actually misses. Trent Richardson, I would say, probably missed on. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, the verdict's still out on him, but he hasn't turned out to be worth that first-round value pick. And then you can make some debates about, where David Wilson was because he had a really high ceiling those couple years, and then he kind of tapered off a little bit. But my response to that is like, a lot of these guys have short shelf life because of the usage rate. If you run them into the ground in 5 years, I think what Nick said was important because you have to find a way to make sure these guys are able to have long careers. Running back is one of the most volatile positions in the NFL. And if you're going to be giving these guys, 17 to 22 touches a game, it's just a numbers game. They're going to run down eventually. So if you're not going to pay them what they're worth, you got to find a way to make sure they last longer. I think that's a big part of the scenario as well. And like we said, go ahead.
The other part about that is like, if you give them less touches though, you're also lessening the value in that way. Like, so I don't think
that's where I disagree. You just got to do it a different way. Look at what Tony Pollard did this year for the Cowboys. You don't have to. Go ahead.
They got to be. What's going to happen is they're going to have to become more hybrid skill position players. Like you're not going to have the Adrian Peterson days are dead. Like like Derrick Henry can do it because he's 245 pounds or whatever, but like that guy just comes out once every 6 years. Like that's not a thing that exists really. You need to have the Debos who can. And even we've heard Debo like wants less touches because he's like getting beat up, man. Like you've got to have guys who can rotate in and out of the backfield. Otherwise, it's just you can't give guys 30. Le'Veon Bell 30 touches a game when that was happening. That was sick, but like it's just not a thing that I think is sustainable anymore.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's going to start to change a little. It's changed a little bit, though. We're starting to see the return of the run game. Man. You saw it this year. Heavy tight end sets. You're running the ball a lot more because now you're combating all the deep safety coverages and the 2 high looks that we're getting, and it's going back around. Now you have to, in my opinion, pay those players what they're worth if you're going to be using them in this aspect. I think everything goes in cycles, but I do agree with what you're saying. It's like the Alvin Kamara versatility or the Austin Eckler versatility. But I do think there's something to be said for those teams. When you need to just line up and run the football, when you need to just get 4 yards, we saw the difference in those teams. The Chargers would have been playing a home game the next week in the playoffs, or excuse me, they would have been going to the Arrowhead if they could have ran the ball in the second half against the Jaguars. I mean, there's just no debate about that. There's something to be said for that. The teams that were in the Super Bowl were the 2 of the top 5 most effective rushing teams in the NFL. Obviously, they had great offensive lines, but the running back play was superior as well. They had great running backs. Even if you don't have a singular guy, the Chiefs did it by committee over the course of the season. But we saw once the playoffs hit later in the season, Pacheco became the guy, and he's going to be the guy going forward. They're going to have to pay him. He may not get top dollar like Kamara or Christian McCaffrey, Derrick Henry top dollar, but enough to where you create a new market for the position and create the value around it. That's why I think Jahmyr Gibbs is going to go first round because he gives you some of that versatility as well, where you can maybe not give him 15 traditional carries inside the tackles, but you can get him 8 to 10 a game. You can get him involved in the passing game. He can go play slot. He can do some really good things out of the backfield. I think that versatility is special, but also you're going to see a guy like Tank Bigsby, who I think is going to go third round, probably come in and make a significant impact for a team. And if he makes a significant impact for a team for 2 or 3 years, he should be paid properly. Same with Josh Jacobs. Why isn't Josh Jacobs? There's no reason that guy who's 25 years old shouldn't get paid.
Here's the issue. here's the issue. And it's really a supply and demand thing. And it's really what it comes down to, because you point out all the quality players who've been drafted in the first round. And I don't think the point is necessarily that first round players are probably going to be bad. It's more about when you look at who else is there: Alvin Kamara, Dalvin Cook, Derrick Henry, Nick Chubb, Joe Mixon, Aaron Jones, Tony Pollard, James Conner, Miles Sanders, Austin Eckler, Kareem Hunt, David Montgomery. I mean, all of these guys, none of them are first round choices. And a lot of them, even maybe most of them, were really good really early. And so what happens is you've got guys who can contribute day one on very inexpensive rookie contracts. So when you're the Raiders and you're sitting there and you're like, do we pay Josh Jacobs, or do we, Breece Hall? I mean, Kenneth Walker. Like, do we wait? Do we draft a guy like Kenneth Walker in the second round, right? Use our first round pick on an offensive lineman or a quarterback, use our second round pick on a running back. And then the question is, yes, is there a drop off? Yeah, maybe, probably. But how much of a drop off? And is that a wise utilization of resources, right? Like, is it better to have Bijan Robinson in the first round or Breece Hall in the second? Is it better to have Josh Jacob in the first round or Nick Chubb in the second, or whoever in the third? It's just the guys are just available, and it's just what it comes down to. And so I think the biggest thing is that guys probably, and this will be tough because this is how you get seen in high school still, even to this day, despite the emergence of all these, 7-on-7 camps, you got to just prioritize yourself as a receiver. You just got to hit the jugs machine. You got to work on routes, and like in every possible opportunity, just try and play a receiver. Right? Even if you're a smaller guy, even if you don't have the body type that a traditional receiver has, just try and play receiver, because it's not until there's a shortage of NFL caliber running backs that we're going to see that market move, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting developmental discussion about high school ball and how I think there's an epidemic of like really poor high school football coaching, and it ends in a situation where like the game at the lower levels is dominated by good running back play, because at the end of the day, that's like simple and easy. Like, give it to your athlete, have them run, right? And so this is the end of the cycle of us seeing like the effect of that, where every draft there are 15 running backs that look like they could be starters. And that's cool and all, but like Myron said, like all these first round picks are hits. We've been talking about this draft nonstop, how many guys there are that I think contribute this year at the running back position. And I think this is like maybe a rarer draft in that we have like 25 such guys, and that's crazy.
Yeah.
But I think about the Najee draft and the problem with like the Steelers locking in at 24. And like I was lower on Najee as a prospect. That's a whole other discussion. I think like he's like a very flashy player that doesn't really hit efficiencies the way, but whatever. Like, Travis Etienne is also a really good player. And Javonte Williams is great, and I think he's probably the best running back in that class when healthy, but, like, he's not healthy. So that's, like, a whole other thing that just, like, kills that argument. Like, it doesn't matter. He doesn't play. It doesn't matter, right? And then Khalil Herbert goes in the 6th round. And personally, from my perspective, like, considering the offensive lines they've dealt with, Khalil Herbert has, like, almost done as good of a job, and granted a limited sample size, as the guys at the top of that draft. And so you have to be certain that the guy you take in the 1st round is that much better than the guys you get later in the draft. This is what Max is saying. And I think it's a very difficult thing to do, because this is a position group that is very dependent on on surrounding cast, like schematically what you're asking to do. Different teams want different types of running back. We're seeing kind of the scouting go in a direction where you draft guys that are specific styles of play more than they are just good at the position, because again, like, you can find these guys in the 5th round. And there has to be an adjustment at lower levels. Like, you can't have this many guys playing running back. It's just, this is like a,
I do agree there. It's a really bad. Yeah, it's really bad at the lower levels of football. You're right.
Like I don't know. Maybe it's really hard to like get a kid to like understand how to read defenses and throw the football, it definitely is. But I mean, you got you got a lot of offenses where like they're playing Navy and Wildcat, and you have quarterbacks getting recruited as running backs because they don't actually ever throw the ball. And, Evan Hall.
I would say a huge problem with that is the offensive line play at lower levels is really, really bad. You don't have it's very hard to find 5 high school offensive linemen that are good and then be able to teach those guys the offense. So I do agree that it's bad. I just don't see a solution going forward.
Yeah,
because the offensive
tough.
line play is really bad. But
there are so many things that go into that too. But go ahead. Well, first, I just want to say this. I want to recognize a couple of things. When you're looking at high school ball, for one thing, the better athletes that are big enough to play offensive line usually play D-line, or not usually, but often play D-line and then have to transition to O-line when they go to college, right? Because that, again, it's about flash sacks, it's about stats, and it's about getting paid, right? Whether it's with NIL or whatever before and then in pros at the next level. Also, it's hard to get a guy to understand how to read defenses and throw the ball, but also there is a huge disparity in terms of guys who can go to these expensive camps and get private coaches and actually have a shot at playing B1 quarterback. I mean, how many incredible athletes never have that opportunity, but they can get a ball in their hand and they can run, they can truck guys and they can juke guys. And that's what their opportunity is, right? So I think there's a lot that goes into it. If you're not a 4-star quarterback recruit who's had, 5 summers of going to passing camps and, and having like legitimate receivers to work with and, getting recruited, it's tough, man. It's tough. Like it's really hard. But yeah, I mean, we're running real long here. So let's just, we pretty much we've hit, I want to give you one last chance to rebut time against this. And then we just got to hit the tight end and linebacker position and kind of like a fell swoop and go.
I'm not really debating anything you guys said because I do agree with a lot of it. It's just that the situations that I'm talking about, these guys are the offense. Yeah. Like you look at what Josh Jacobs did last year, his production, Saquon Barkley, his production. The Steelers' offensive line isn't good. What Najee Harris has done behind those guys for 2 years in a row has been pretty remarkable, in my opinion. The usage rate is really high, but that's also the point. If you're in those type of situations where you aren't behind the Eagles' offensive line, you aren't in San Francisco, and you have 3 really good backs and versatility and Kyle Shanahan calling plays, these guys are the offense. The offense is built around these guys because the quarterback play isn't great. The offensive line play isn't great. Those are the type of guys that I'm talking about getting paid. Derrick Henry in Tennessee, if you're going to be this reliant on those guys, then you can't then in turn say that, well, they don't have value because somebody else could do it, but because we don't really see it from the other guys. A lot of the other guys are just by committee, or you get a team like the Commanders that have 2 really good guys that you can go back to back with. I believe B-Rob was drafted, second, third round? I don't remember. But third round. So you got 2 guys like Antonio Gibson, who's the guy from my JUCO in Mississippi. You got to give him a shout out. But I'm talking about the guys that are the bell cows, that are the offense is literally built and revolved around those guys. You can't build the offense around those guys and count on them to carry your offense and then in turn say that they can't get paid.
Yeah. There's an inequity there for sure. All right, let's talk, and I'm sure we will revisit this. All right, this is not a conversation that's over, but for today, we're going to move on. We're just going to talk about linebacker and tight end real quick. Nick, we're going to let you go first, and then we're probably going to have to let you go. I'm probably running a little bit longer than I should as well. So let's dive into it and knock these out.
Yeah, really quick, because I think these are really similar position groups. I just wanted to say right before I hop off that if you have a guy who's a stud, pay him. I think it's a little harder with the linebacker position because defense is, a position that's like is a whole unit that's getting kind of screwed by the rules a little bit here. But certainly tight ends like the George Kittles and the Travis Kelce's. I don't even think it's like a question like what actually these guys impact their offenses. They're effectively wide receivers that just give completely different looks to defenses. They're hard to scheme against. They allow you to have game plans that are extremely unique and get these offensive coordinators head coaching jobs and paid a massive contract, right? Like all these like genius offensive coordinators are just guys that have tight ends. I don't know if that's actually why, but it's kind of funny that it's the way that it's happened. Linebackers are kind of one of the few ways to counter against that as a defense. And because so few teams have it, these tight ends have kind of taken over the league, right? So, when you have a Fred Warner, it allows the Niners defense to do different things where they can play more base than most defenses would because they just have this crazy 235-pound guy that can run with a slot receiver. That doesn't exist in the league, really. So, that's my take on that. There's going to be a lot of fifth-round picks that give you reliable play at both of these position groups. But when you eventually hit on a toolsy guy in the fourth round who's just different, you got to give him money.
Yep. I mean, I think the issue is you just never know who's going to be that elite caliber of player coming out of college. So you kind of have to wait and see. This is one of the reasons it's so hard to draft these guys early. But once you got them, I think you do need to just make sure you keep them, right? I think that's clear as day. But Nick, let's let you get out of here.
Okay.
I know that all of us have to go, but you're on a little bit more of a crunch than us. So
Yeah.
We'll finish up this conversation. Remember to follow Nick at Nick with Sports. He's our director of draft content and scouting, and we'll be back, I believe, this Thursday to pick up these conversations among many others. So, okay. Look, so for my take on tight ends in particular, it's that there are tight ends is actually two positions, right? You either have
100%.
blocking or you have receiving. You got one or the other most of the time. When you actually have both, that is a player that is truly, truly valuable. But we rarely have both. And a lot of times the guys that are actually both aren't immediately that, because you got to learn blocking schemes. You got to learn coverages. You got to learn routes. Like, there's so much development that comes at the NFL level that taking this guy high is maybe not a recipe for a lot of production while he's under contract, right? And so you're better off taking a guy who has traits and some skill and developing him, because you might not really see much of a difference in terms of what they contribute early on. But if you have a guy that can do one or the other, that's great. But you also probably won't take them super early because, again, they're specialized. They're either an extra blocker or they're a receiver who probably doesn't put up as many yards as a wide receiver. So tight end is super fascinating to me because there's so rarely a guy that I genuinely believe can do both at a very high level early. And that's why I just pound the table for Darnell Washington. I think he's truly a one-of-one type player in a way that I never really – Kyle Pitts is one-of-one in terms of size, but in terms of tight end, that's how I feel about Darnell Washington. So how do you feel about tight end and what's your take on that?
Well, I agree with everything that you guys said. And the thing that I'll go back to is just there's not an emphasis on it at the collegiate level. So whereas we get to see a lot of these guys at other positions really get to shine and be the center of the offense and be the focal point. Even on defense, you see guys, and what a great edge player looks like because they're highlighted. Or you get a Brian Branch that gets used as a Swiss Army knife at Alabama. You get to see these guys' skill set on display all the time. You don't really get to see a ton of tight ends at the collegiate level. So it's almost, it's almost always projection and what you think these guys can be. You get a guy like in this draft who I think is going to be really good, but probably won't go into the second round, or is Sam Laporta from Iowa. He was really good inline blocking tight end. He does a really good job in that aspect, but he's also really good receiving the ball. He's not as he doesn't catch your eye quite like a Darnell Washington will, because I do agree with you. I think he should be a first round pick, and his value is immense. But I think that's the big thing when you talk about these guys. They're underutilized. Look at Mark Andrews at Oklahoma. Very, very good production as a receiver. There were some questions about whether he could be a non-blocker. He turned out to be a really good blocker as well. And you see when he got to the NFL, I think they took him in the third round, if I'm not mistaken. But that's about the sweet spot for those guys. So also, I do think something that needs to be highlighted here is that they get drafted later, but they get paid very well once they have this, given or that displayed that ability to be really good at both. Or even a guy like I think Dallas Goedert is going to get paid pretty well here. And he's not a great blocker.
He did, yeah.
He's really good.
He did get paid.
So exactly. So you start to see guys like that at the tight end position. They're going to get paid once they've displayed that at the next level. So I think that might be a disparity between them and some of the other positions that maybe get drafted a little bit later. Running backs, linebackers, what have you. Even we talked about the nickel corners earlier that will go later in the draft. Have a hard time getting paid. But those guys are going to get paid for sure because, like you said, there's not a ton of them to choose from. Even though I think we're getting into a more golden age of the hybrid tight ends, I think this is going to be a really good tight end draft. In the next 4 or 5 years, we'll look back at this draft and be like, there was a ton of good players in this one. Coming up next year, you got guys like Brock Bowers that are going to be coming out. And I think they'll start to kind of change the narrative here, maybe how high they start to get taken. But for now, I think they're appropriately drafted and then appropriately paid when it's their time in the NFL.
I think it's interesting. I think that the most of them are appropriately paid, but there's a couple guys who aren't, and that's just because the market is actually held lower because there aren't that many impact players at the position, right? So it's like you got your Kittle and your Kelsey and even your Darren Waller for a period of time there who were major impact players, but they never got wide receiver like money because for them, they would have to jump the market by this inextricable amount. Like it would be huge. It'd be like, it would be like adding 25% onto the pay rate for tight ends. And that's just not really the way contract negotiations go. So, they're actually kind of like artificially held kind of lower than they probably should be. But for the most part, tight ends are paid once they're, they have finished their contract because one, there's not the super short shelf life on them, but also because you can't turn around and just go back to the draft and be like, I'm just going to get a contributor. You know what I mean? Like there's no guarantee that that's going to happen. So, I think that it is interesting. And I think that, I value receiving tight ends well enough, but to me, a guy who can truly do both is a rare beast. And a guy who can truly do both early is a very rare beast. And so that's why I'm so high on him. And I would probably be one of the few people in the world who wouldn't criticize a team for taking Darnell Washington in the top 10. I really think he's that kind of guy. So I doubt it will happen, but there's an outside shot. And he definitely could go top 15, I think, because there's going to be someone somewhere who's like, this guy is it's ridiculous. Do they pick in the top 15? I don't know. But I just want to get my opinion out there on him early. And then from the linebacker perspective, it's just hard to find. This is kind of similar to the safety nickel conversation in that a guy who can do all of the things that you need him to do at a very high level is hard. Are you big enough to fit the run? Are you big enough to take on guards and shed those blocks? And are you athletic and instinctive enough in coverage? You know what I mean? When the ball's in the air, are you able to close on it? How do you react? It's just tough to find those guys. So we do have a few at the top of the market who get paid very well, but there are just very few of them. I think they're very few and far between. And that's a tough translation from college to NFL. You know what I mean? I think usually there's a guy who did one of those things well in college, and they're probably going to do that well in the pros, but will they be able to pick up the other part? That's such a projection that it's tough for me to justify taking a linebacker in the first round, knowing that there's just a reasonable chance that they'll never develop both aspects of the game that you need to have. So it's a little bit of a lost position here. Not in the same way that running backs are. It's kind of the opposite. There's so few guys who make a major impact versus so many guys who make a major impact. But it's probably like the conversely, tough position. And again, it's like, when you're lacking an elite tight end, you just kind of work around it. Well, if you're lacking an elite linebacker, it's like that's just where teams target you because it's a reactive position, right? So defenses tend to be that way. But what are your thoughts on linebacker here before we roll out of here?
Pretty much the same. And I think it's a lot, it's akin to the tight end position that when you do find your guy, they tend to get paid pretty well. I don't know the numbers compared to other position groups, but if we're talking about the linebacker market itself, you start to see those guys like when Bobby Wagner got his deal. We just saw Roquan Smith get paid. We just saw Tremaine Edmonds get paid. You're going to see those guys get paid because of what we just said. It's hard to find a guy that's either so exceptional at what he does that you can kind of ignore some of the versatility issues and address it with like a safety or what have you, or a guy that can do a little bit of both, like a Fred Warner. I mean, Fred Warner is a one-of-one. We saw him, covering, number 2 wide receivers in the slot, carrying them to the safety in the playoff game against Dallas. We saw him, making plays in the backfield. We saw him conducting traffic in the middle. You don't see a lot of those guys. So when you do find these guys, it's not a problem with other positions getting their pay, getting their just due. They get paid, and that's kind of my take on it. I think they're pretty much appropriately drafted. I think you'll see a run on linebackers in the 2nd and 3rd round this year. And then if those guys are productive and they come into their own and they're impact players, you'll see those guys get paid. And so we start to see those can't miss prospects again. I think this is where you're going to start seeing them drafted, the sweet spot for those guys, 2nd, 3rd round, and then they'll get paid respectively once they get to the NFL. So not as much of a controversial topic or position group as some of the other that we talked about. But I do think that these guys are appropriately drafted and then appropriately paid afterwards.
Well, I think, if anything, some of them are even potentially overpaid just because there's so few, right? Like Tremaine Edmonds, we're really looking at him like an $18 million per year player. Like,
Right.
got paid.
Yeah,
but is that really,
you're right.
So there's just so few though. Like, I mean, even you look at it, like this year we had CJ Mosley as a second team All Pro, right? Good player, but I think there's a notable drop off between Fred Warner and him, right? Whereas with most positions, whoever's in the first team and second team All Pro probably both had exceptional years. CJ Mosley was good, but I think if that's your third or fourth best linebacker in the NFL, there's just a clear gap between the truly elite and just the good. That's just kind of how I feel about it, And I don't think Roquan was an All-Pro because he started the season on the Bears. They weren't having the best year, and he had, went to the Ravens where he was, highlighted a little bit more in terms of national coverage. So he probably missed out on his opportunity to get All-Pro last year. Or correct me if I'm wrong if he was, but I don't think he was.
I believe he was players All-Pro, that's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how, as time moves on, if people start to value the players more or the media more, or it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, there's just not many. I mean, you got Fred Warner, you got Roquan Smith, you got Shaq Leonard, who's great but always hurt, and then you've got some safeties who kind of play linebacker. But then there's just a bunch of guys who are all pretty good, but I don't think anybody that just Dre Greenlaw is probably the other one. But again, he's not even getting paid like he should be, honestly. But nobody else really strikes me as like this incredible player. Eric Kendricks is kind of past his prime because he was there for a while. Obviously, Bobby Wagner was there for a long time. He's not really that guy anymore. He's good, but not like, changing the game for a defense good. So there's just so few that it is what it is. And I think that's kind of the tight end conversation as well. But it's harder to, again, with tight end, if you don't have a great one, you just don't focus your offense there. With defense, you just kind of got to make do with whatever you got because teams will go after you if they can. But all right. Good conversation today. Went longer than I thought it would, but I enjoyed it very much. Remember, I'm at the Maxine on Twitter. You can find Kyron at Kyron Samuels. Noah is at No Ashtray Sports. Nick is at Nick with Sports. You can find Defiant Takes Football at Defiant Takes on all social media outlets. You can find us live again every Monday and Thursday, also being released on the podcast feed. You can find player breakdowns for the offensive line and all other position groups between Kyron and myself and Nick with myself, and all published written work is at defianttakesfootball.com. Thanks, y'all. We will see you again very soon.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.